The barn thermometer read 22 degrees when Claire Whitmore pushed open the heavy wooden door at 5:30 that November morning. Her breath came in clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating into the darkness overhead, where rafters disappeared into shadows that the single overhead bulb could not quite reach. Frost had painted intricate patterns across every surface it could claim, transforming the barn into something almost beautiful in the pale light before dawn. The metal latches on the stall doors wore crystalline patterns that looked like ferns. The windows were opaque with ice that would not melt until the sun climbed high enough to remember this corner of Montana. The 19 horses in her care shifted in their stalls at the sound of her boots on the concrete floor, a symphony of movement and breath that filled the barn with life. Their warm bodies created pockets of heat in the cold darkness that smelled of hay and leather and manure, and the particular sweetness of horses in winter, a scent Claire had known her entire life. It was the smell of home, of work, of continuity across generations. Her great-grandfather had smelled this same smell in a barn he built with his own hands. Her father had breathed it every morning of his life, until the morning he did not wake up to smell anything at all. Claire moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had done this alone for so long that the motions had become a kind of meditation. Her hands knew where every tool hung, every latch turned, every horse waited. She did not need to think about the work anymore. Her body simply did it, muscles remembering patterns worn deep over 37 winters. Gunner, her buckskin stallion, nickered softly when she reached his stall. He was 10 years old now, in his prime, powerful and sure-footed with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than a horse should. His coat gleamed like old gold even in the dim light, and his black mane fell thick and coarse over his neck. Claire had raised him from a foal, had gentled him herself, had trained him to read her moods and anticipate her needs. Sometimes she thought Gunner knew her better than any human ever had. She pressed her forehead against his neck for a moment, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. The horse stood still, patient, accepting the gesture of affection with the grace of an animal who understood that his person needed this small connection. Claire closed her eyes and just breathed, letting the simple fact of the horse's presence anchor her to the moment. This was real. This was solid. The rest of the world might be falling apart, but Gunner was here, warm and alive and reliable in ways that people had never been. The radio on the shelf crackled with the 6 a.m. weather report. Claire had left it on overnight, the way ranchers did when they needed to stay current with conditions. The forecaster's voice carried that particular tone of warning that every person who worked the land in Montana had learned to recognize. Not panic, exactly, more like calm insistence. The kind of voice that said this is serious and you need to pay attention. A major storm system was building over the Canadian Rockies, the forecaster said, expected to sweep south through the high plains within 48 hours. Current models showed wind speeds potentially reaching 60 miles per hour with gusts up to 70. Snowfall accumulation of 3 feet or more in the valleys, significantly higher in elevated areas. Temperature dropping to 10 below zero before wind chill. This would be a blizzard, the kind that could cut a ranch off from the world for days. The kind that killed cattle and collapsed barns and left people stranded. The kind that reminded everyone out here that nature did not care about human plans or human survival. Claire continued filling hay nets, her hands steady despite the cold that made her fingers ache even through her insulated work gloves. She talked to the horses as she worked, a habit she had developed over the past 2 years. They were the only voices she heard most days, aside from her own. "Morning, Sadie," she said to the gray mare in stall 3. "You ready for some breakfast?" The mare whickered in response, pressing her nose against Claire's arm. "Yeah, me too," Claire said. "Big storm coming. We're going to be stuck inside for a few days. Better eat up while you can." She moved down the line, greeting each horse by name, touching each one, making sure they knew she was there and they were safe. The isolation had crept up on her gradually, like winter itself, like the way snow accumulates one flake at a time until suddenly you are buried. First, she had stopped going to the monthly Ranchers Association meetings. Those had seemed pointless after Michael died. All those people offering sympathy she did not want and advice she did not need. Then she had let her subscription to the book club in town lapse. Reading about other people's lives felt hollow when her own life had contracted to the size of a ranch and a barn, and the daily work that never ended. Phone calls from friends went unanswered until eventually the phone stopped ringing at all. People got the message. Claire Whitmore wanted to be left alone, and Montana people, God bless them, respected that. They understood about grief and privacy and the things you kept to yourself because speaking them out loud made them too real. The Whitmore Ranch spread across 3,000 acres of northeastern Montana grassland, tucked between the Missouri River breaks to the east and a landscape that rolled toward the Canadian border like frozen waves. The land was not gentle here. It never had been. This was high plains country where winter could kill you and summer could break you, and the only constant was wind. But it was beautiful in a way that got into your blood if you were born to it. The sky went on forever. The grass rippled like water when the wind blew. At night the stars were so bright and so many that they seemed close enough to touch. Her great-grandfather, William Whitmore, had claimed this land in 1912, back when homesteading meant gambling your life against the prairie. He had built the first house with lumber hauled 60 miles by wagon. He had dug the first well by hand, 50 feet down through rock and clay until he hit water. He had broken the first horses and planted the first crops, and survived the first winters when the temperature dropped so low that exposed skin froze in minutes, and cattle died standing up in the fields. His son, Claire's grandfather, had expanded the operation during the years between the wars. He had added the big barn, the one Claire stood in now. He had brought in better breeding stock, had built the fence lines that still marked the property boundaries. He had weathered the depression by being tougher than hardship, by working longer hours than seemed humanly possible, by refusing to give up when half the ranches around them failed. Her father, James Whitmore, had modernized everything. He had added irrigation, updated equipment, built the system of pasture rotation that kept the grass healthy and the cattle fat. He had made the ranch not just survivable but profitable. He had given Claire an inheritance that was worth something, that could support a life if you were willing to work for it. 3 generations of Whitmore men had built this operation into something that mattered, something that lasted. Now it was just her, and some days the weight of that legacy felt like it might crush her. Because what good was all that history, all that accumulated work and wisdom, if it ended with Claire dying alone in a barn at 37, because she could not figure out how to live without the man she loved? Gunnar pushed his nose against her shoulder, patient and gentle, pulling her back from the spiral of dark thoughts. Claire scratched behind his ears, the way he liked, and took a breath. The stallion had been with her through everything. He had been there the morning Michael died, standing in this same barn, waiting for breakfast that came late because Claire had been on the phone with the sheriff, her world falling apart one word at a time. 20 months ago, 607 days to be exact, though Claire tried not to count anymore. Some days it felt like yesterday. She would turn around expecting to see Michael coming through the barn door with coffee and that crooked smile, and the absence would hit her all over again like a physical blow. Other days it felt like Michael Torres had been gone her whole life, like the 3 years they had spent together were something she had imagined or dreamed. The memory came whether she wanted it or not. November morning, not unlike this one. Temperature in the low 20s, sky that particular shade of gray that promised snow before nightfall. Claire had woken at 5 as usual, had started the coffee, had been pulling on her boots when the phone rang. Emergency call for Michael. A rancher 40 miles north had a cow in trouble, breech birth, complications. The man's voice on the phone had been tight with worry. Michael was the only large animal veterinarian within 100 miles who would drive out in bad weather, who would come at dawn, who understood that sometimes an animal's life could not wait for convenience or daylight. Claire had made him coffee in the travel mug he liked while he loaded his truck with the equipment he might need. The veterinary bag with the obstetric chains and the lubricant and the antibiotics, the portable ultrasound machine, extra gloves, warm blankets. Michael had been methodical, checking everything twice, making sure he had what he needed. He was always thorough. It was one of the things Claire loved about him. He had kissed her at the door, his lips warm despite the cold that rushed in from outside. She could still remember exactly how he had smiled at her, that crooked grin that made her heart turn over even after 3 years together. His dark eyes had been warm and alive and completely present. "Be careful," she had said, pulling his coat collar up around his neck. "Roads are icy." "Always am," he had replied, touching her cheek with one gloved hand. "Back by noon. We can work on the wedding plans, figure out where we're putting everybody for the reception." The wedding that never happened. The future that died on a mountain pass when Michael's truck hit black ice on a curve and rolled 300 feet down a ravine into a frozen creek. The sheriff said he died on impact, that he had not suffered. Claire did not know if that was true or just something people said to make the living feel better about the dead. She knew only that Michael had left that morning alive and thinking about where to put tables at their wedding reception, and he had come back in a body bag, and that the part of her that knew how to be happy had gone with him. The funeral had been well attended. Michael had been loved in this community, respected for his skill and his willingness to drive through any weather to help an animal in need. He had saved countless horses and cattle and dogs over his years of practice. He had charged fairly and never turned anyone away because they could not pay. Good man, people had said. Such a good man. Too young. Such a waste. Claire had stood by the grave and felt nothing. The numbness had settled over her like snow, cold and complete. People had tried to help. They had brought food, casseroles that filled her freezer, comfort food that she could not taste. They had offered shoulders to cry on, ears to listen, hands to hold. They had told her it would get better with time, that grief had stages, that she would heal. She had smiled and thanked them and felt absolutely empty inside, like something essential had been scooped out of her chest, leaving only a cavity where her heart used to be. After the funeral, after everyone went home and she was alone again in the ranch house that was supposed to have become their home together, Claire had thrown herself into ranch work. Physical exhaustion became a drug she needed, a way to stop thinking, stop feeling. If she worked hard enough, pushed herself far enough, she could fall into bed too tired to think, too tired to dream, too tired to lie awake at 3 in the morning replaying that last kiss at the door. The ranch gave her that escape. The endless cycle of feeding and mending and checking fences and moving cattle. In summer she had 18-hour days. In winter the days were shorter but the work was harder, fighting cold and snow and the constant threat of equipment failure. She worked until her body screamed and her hands bled and exhaustion pulled her under into dreamless sleep. The isolation had been a choice at first, a conscious decision to avoid the well-meaning sympathy that made everything hurt worse. Then it had become a habit, the default setting of her life. Then it had become who she was. Claire Whitmore, 37 years old, running the Whitmore ranch alone, speaking to no one, connected to nothing except the land and the animals and the legacy she was determined not to let die. Claire finished with the horses and stepped back outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen. The radio forecast echoed in her mind. 48 hours. She had that long to prepare, to make sure she had everything she needed to weather what was coming. Claire finished with the horses and stepped back outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen, that particular metallic scent that came before a big storm. The temperature had dropped another few degrees while she was in the barn. Her face went numb almost immediately despite the scarf wrapped around her neck. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking out across the ranch. The land spread before her in shades of darkness and pre-dawn gray. She could just make out the fence lines, the shape of the equipment shed, the rise of the hill where the south pasture began. This was the view her father had seen every morning of his life. This was the land he had loved enough to sacrifice friendship for, to work himself to death for. James Whitmore had survived 63 Montana winters before his heart gave out 2 years ago. He had been fixing fence on the north pasture, a section that had been damaged during spring runoff. It was not urgent work. It could have waited. But James Whitmore did not believe in leaving tasks undone, and he certainly did not believe in asking for help. Claire had been in town that day, picking up supplies. She had been gone maybe 5 hours total. When she got back, the truck was parked by the barn, but her father was nowhere to be found. She had walked the property calling his name, a knot of worry growing in her stomach. He always came when called. Always. She had found him 6 hours after he died, lying in the grass near the fence he had been mending, his tools scattered around him. His face had been peaceful, she remembered that. No pain, no fear. Just that stubborn expression he wore when he was concentrating on work. As if he had been annoyed by his heart's betrayal, frustrated that his body had quit before the job was done. The guilt of that discovery still sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. If she had been there, if she had insisted on going with him, on helping despite his protests that he could handle it himself, if she had come home an hour earlier, 2 hours earlier, if she had insisted he see a doctor about the chest pains he had been having, the ones he had dismissed as indigestion. The what-ifs could drive a person crazy, but they kept coming anyway, relentless as winter. Her older brother David had flown in from California for the funeral. He was 45 now, an engineer with a good job and a life that had nothing to do with ranching. He had left Montana 20 years ago for college and never looked back, choosing a career that did not require him to wake at 5 in the morning or work until his back ached or worry about whether his livelihood would survive the next drought. At the funeral, standing beside their father's grave under a sky that threatened rain, David had turned to Claire with worry written all across his face. His city suit had looked wrong in the cemetery, too crisp and clean for the reality of ranching life. "You don't have to do this alone," he had said, his voice quiet enough that the other mourners could not hear. "Sell the ranch. Come to California. Start over. You could go back to school, finish that degree you started. Do something that doesn't require you to sacrifice everything." "This is me," she had told him, looking at the casket being lowered into Montana soil. "I can't leave. Dad built this. Grandpa built this. Great-grandpa broke this land. How can I just walk away?" "Then you'll die out here alone," David had said, and his voice had cracked. "Just like Dad did. Is that what you want? To die fixing a fence with no one around to even notice for hours?" He had meant it as warning, not prophecy. Claire understood that. David loved her, worried about her, but he did not understand that leaving was not an option, not for her. The ranch was not just where she lived. It was who she was. The land was in her blood, in her bones. Leaving would mean admitting that 3 generations of Whitmore determination meant nothing. It would mean her father had died for land that was not worth keeping. It would mean Michael's faith in their future together. His plan to merge his veterinary practice with her ranching operation had been built on sand. Claire had not explained any of this to David. How could she make him understand something he had spent 20 years trying to escape? Instead, she had hugged him and promised to be careful and sent him back to California, back to his life of scheduled days and climate-controlled offices and problems that did not involve animals dying or equipment breaking or weather that could kill you. And then she had been alone, truly alone. Her mother had died when Claire was 15, cancer that took her fast and mean. Her younger sister had moved to Seattle after college and called maybe twice a year. David was in California. Michael was dead. Her father was dead. The ranch stretched around her like an ocean, beautiful and isolating and utterly without mercy. He had meant it as warning, not prophecy. But standing in the barn that November morning, Claire wondered if her brother had been right. If she was just running out the clock, waiting for her own heart to give out or for a winter storm to claim her the way it claimed someone in these parts every few years. The sun rose slowly that morning, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold and violet that would have been beautiful if they had not carried that particular quality that came before bad weather. Claire knew this sky. Every rancher in Montana knew it. The colors were too vivid, too saturated. The light had an edge to it that made everything look sharp and slightly unreal. She drove her truck out to check the cattle in the south pasture, the heater blowing warm air that barely touched the cold that had settled into her bones. The road across her property was rough, more track than actual road, worn by 3 generations of trucks making the same journey. Her father had driven this route every morning, his father before him. Now it was her turn to count heads, check for injuries, make sure the herd was safe. The cattle looked good, healthy and fat from the summer grass. She counted heads out of habit, making sure none had wandered off or gotten into trouble. 93, all accounted for. Their winter coats had come in thick and dark, nature's preparation for what was coming. They grazed peacefully, unconcerned about weather forecasts and human worries. For them, there was only this moment, this grass, this day. Claire envied them that simplicity sometimes. Satisfied that the herd was secure, she turned the truck toward town. The drive took 40 minutes on roads that were paved but barely. This far from anywhere, maintenance was something that happened when the county had money and time, which was almost never. The pavement was cracked and potholed, patched with asphalt that never quite matched the original road. In some places, the frost heaves had created rises and dips that could bottom out a truck if you did not know where they were. Claire knew. She had driven this road since she was 16 and her father first let her take the truck to town alone. She could drive it in her sleep, knew every curve and dip and dangerous patch. The landscape rolled past, familiar as her own face. Grass and fence posts and the occasional ranch house set back from the road. Every few miles a mailbox marked where someone lived, where a family had staked their claim to this hard land. The feed store sat on the edge of town, a weathered building that had been there longer than Claire had been alive. The paint had faded to gray years ago, and no one had bothered to refresh it. A sign hung crooked over the door advertising feed and tack and supplies. The parking lot was gravel, pocked with potholes that filled with water when it rained and ice when it froze. Charlie Dawson ran the place, a man in his 70s who knew more about ranching than most people forgot. He had been selling feed since before Claire was born. He had sold to her grandfather, to her father, now to her. He was a permanent fixture, like the mountains or the wind, something that had always been there and presumably always would be. He looked up when the bell over the door announced her arrival, and his weathered face creased into a smile that made his eyes nearly disappear in wrinkles earned from 70 years of Montana sun and wind. "Claire Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying genuine pleasure. "Well, I'll be. Ain't seen you in months, girl. How you holding up out there?" "Fine," she said automatically. Charlie gave her a look that said he knew better, but he was kind enough not to push. Montana people understood about privacy, about the things you kept to yourself. You did not pry. You offered help if it seemed welcome, and you stepped back if it did not. Big storm coming, he observed, moving behind the counter. You getting set for it? Working on it, Claire said. Need some supplies. She gathered what she needed, loading items into her cart while Charlie tallied the cost. Vitamin supplements for the horses. Extra grain in case the storm lasted longer than predicted. Salt blocks. Wormer. The routine supplies that kept a ranch running. Charlie talked while he worked, the easy conversation of someone comfortable with silence but willing to fill it if his customer seemed to want company. Storm's gonna be a bad one, he said. Radio says worst in 40 years. You got enough firewood, generator working, water situation solid. All set, Claire confirmed. Brought the cattle in from the far pastures yesterday. Horses are in the barn, wood stacked, generator tested and fueled. You're your father's daughter, Charlie said with approval. James always said preparation beat panic every time. The mention of her father sent a small pang through Claire's chest, but she pushed it away. There was no room for sentiment when a storm was coming. Charlie paused in his tallying and looked at her with that direct gaze old men earned the right to use. Then he said, "Oh, I almost forgot. Ruth Carmichael was in earlier this morning. She's up north of you, isn't she? Out on Old County Road 7. Claire knew the name vaguely. A woman who had bought hay from the Whitmore ranch last summer. The transaction had been brief and businesslike. Ruth had driven up in an old Ford truck that looked like it had been kept running through sheer stubbornness and constant maintenance. She had been maybe 60, lean and weathered, with gray hair pulled back in a braid and hands that showed a lifetime of work. She had paid in cash, counted out bills with careful precision. She had loaded the hay herself, 20 bales, refusing Claire's offer of help with a polite but firm no thank you. There had been something about the older woman that Claire had recognized even then, a kind of determined solitude, a refusal to show weakness or need, a wall built high enough that casual acquaintances could not scale it. Claire had understood because she had built the same kind of wall around herself. I think so, Claire said, bringing herself back to the present. Charlie shook his head, his expression troubled. Poor woman. Phone's been out at her place for days, she said. Storm coming and she's all alone out there. Her husband Tom died, 3 years back now. Heart just gave out on him. And she's been running that ranch by herself ever since. Small operation, maybe 800 acres, but still. That's a lot for one person at her age. Claire felt something stir in her chest. Concern, maybe. Recognition, certainly. She wondered if people in town talked about her the same way. Poor Claire Whitmore, all alone out there on that big ranch. Her fiancé dead, her father dead, nobody to help her. What's going to happen when she can't do it anymore? She doing okay? Claire heard herself ask. Charlie shrugged, his face suggesting he had his doubts but was too polite to say it outright. You know Ruth, proud as they come. Won't admit if she's struggling. Won't ask for help if her life depended on it. But I worry about her. Woman that age, all alone in ranch country when a storm like this hits. If something happens, if she gets hurt or sick, who's even going to know? He paused, loading Claire's purchases into cardboard boxes, then looked up at her with meaning. Might be worth checking on her after the weather clears. Just to make sure she's all right. Neighbors looking after neighbors, you know. That's how we survive out here. Claire nodded non-committally, not wanting to commit to anything but understanding the suggestion. As she was loading the boxes into her truck, Charlie came out and called after her one more thing. Oh, she mentioned something kind of funny. Said her mare Rusty's been acting strange lately. Keeps trying to head south toward your place whenever they ride out. Wants to go back there for some reason, Ruth said. Horses are funny that way, you know. They remember places. Remember things that matter to them. Don't quite know what she makes of the place, but that mare of Ruth's sure seems to think your ranch is worth visiting. The comment stuck with Claire as she drove home. She remembered the mare now, could picture her clearly. A chestnut with a white blaze down her face, maybe 15 hands, sturdy and well-proportioned. The horse had seemed well cared for, her coat gleaming, her hooves properly trimmed, her eyes alert and calm. The kind of horse that came from someone who took pride in their animals, who saw them as partners rather than just livestock. Claire wondered what made an animal remember a place, what drew it back to somewhere it had been only once for a couple of hours while hay was being loaded. Did horses sense something humans could not? Did they recognize some quality in a place or a person that mattered to them in ways we could not understand? The drive back took longer than the drive out. The wind had strengthened, pushing against the truck hard enough that Claire had to fight the wheel to keep from drifting. The first snowflakes had begun to fall, not the full storm yet, just the scouts, the advance guard. But they were coming faster now, swirling in the wind, sticking to the windshield before the wipers could clear them away. Claire watched the sky darken as she drove, that peculiar greenish-black color that every rancher learned to dread. The color that meant business, that meant this was not going to be one of those storms that blew through in a few hours leaving a pretty dusting of snow. This was going to be the real thing, the kind of storm her grandfather used to talk about, the kind that buried fence lines and collapsed barns and left the world unrecognizable under feet of snow. The radio crackled again with an updated forecast, the voice of the meteorologist carrying a new note of urgency. The storm was accelerating, moving faster than the models had predicted. White-out conditions expected by 8 that evening, a full 12 hours earlier than the original estimate. Anyone caught outside after dark would be in serious danger. Travelers were advised to complete their journeys immediately. Ranchers were advised to secure livestock and shelter in place. Claire pressed harder on the gas pedal, the truck bouncing over rough patches of road. She needed to get home, needed to finish her preparations while she still could. Back at the ranch, Claire spent the afternoon in controlled urgency. The work needed to be thorough but fast, every task completed before darkness fell and the storm arrived in full force. She had done this before, prepared for winter storms, but something about this one felt different, bigger, more dangerous. The kind of storm that became a marker in time, the kind people referred to for years afterward. Remember the November storm of '24, the one that buried everything for a week. She started with the cattle, loading salt blocks and extra hay into the truck, and driving out to the sheltered valley on the north side of the property. The valley was one of the ranch's best features, carved by a creek that ran year-round and lined with cottonwoods that broke the wind. The cattle could shelter there, protected by the lay of the land and the trees, with access to water even if everything else froze. Moving the herd took 2 hours. The cattle were reluctant to leave the pasture where they had been grazing, content and undisturbed. Claire rode Gunner, working the edges of the herd, pushing them gently but firmly toward the valley. The stallion was good at this work, patient and steady, knowing when to press and when to hold back. He moved the cattle with minimal fuss, his body language communicating authority without aggression. By the time the last cow had filed into the valley, Claire's hands were numb and her face burned from the cold wind. But the herd was secure, positioned as safely as they could be. If the storm was as bad as predicted, some might die anyway. There was only so much you could do against nature, but she had given them the best chance possible. Next came the generator. She checked the fuel level, topped it off from the reserve tank, ran it for 15 minutes to make sure it started and ran smoothly. The engine coughed once, then caught, settling into a steady rhythm. She let it run while she moved on to other tasks, ears attuned to any change in sound that might indicate a problem. The firewood came next. She brought armload after armload from the woodshed, stacking it on the covered porch where she could reach it even if the snow came up to the windows. Her father had always insisted on keeping at least 3 days' worth of wood accessible. Claire made sure she had 5. If the power went out and stayed out, the wood stove would be the only heat source. Running out was not an option. She filled every container she owned with water, buckets and pots and bowls and jars, the bathtub, coolers lined up in the mudroom. If the pipes froze or the well pump lost power, she would need every drop. Water was life. You could survive without a lot of things, but not without water. The horses went into the barn last. Each one led from pasture to stall with extra time given for calming and settling. They were more restless now, picking up on Claire's tension and their own instinctive awareness that something was coming. Their ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds Claire could not hear. Their nostrils flared, reading scents on the wind that meant nothing to human senses but everything to horses. She gave each one extra hay and fresh water. She checked their legs for cuts or swelling, their hooves for stones or cracks, their eyes for any sign of illness. She spoke to each horse by name, touched each one, made sure they knew she was there and they were safe. This was her herd, her responsibility. If something happened to them because she had not prepared properly, that failure would be hers alone to carry. Gunnar was last. She spent extra time with him, brushing his coat until it gleamed even in the dim light, picking out his hooves with care, checking the gelding in the stall next to him who sometimes got aggressive when confined. The stallion stood quietly, accepting her attention with the patience of an old friend. When she finished, he lowered his head and she rested her forehead against his face, drawing strength from his solid presence. "We'll get through this," she told him quietly. "We always do." By the time Claire finished, it was nearly dark and the snow was falling steadily. She stood in the barn doorway and watched the world disappear into white. The visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet. Beyond that, everything was just swirling whiteness and the sound of wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She looked toward the north, toward where Ruth Carmichael's ranch sat 12 miles away across roads that were probably already impassable. Was the woman prepared? Did she have enough wood, enough water? Was she frightened, sitting alone in her house while this monster bore down? Or was she like Claire, grimly going through the motions of preparation because that was what you did, what your father had taught you to do, what 3 generations before you had done? Not your responsibility, Claire told herself again. The woman is a stranger. You barely know her. But the thought would not leave her alone. Inside the house, Claire made herself dinner without tasting it. Soup from a can heated on the stove, bread that was starting to go stale, an apple that had seen better days. She ate standing at the counter, looking out the window at the snow that fell harder with each passing minute. The world outside had disappeared. There was nothing now but white and wind and the sound of the house creaking under the assault. She washed her bowl and spoon by hand, not trusting the dishwasher to finish its cycle if the power went out mid-wash. Everything had to be considered now. Every action had to account for the possibility of being cut off from electricity, from heat, from everything the modern world took for granted. The phone rang just as she was drying her hands. The sound was jarring in the quiet house. Claire almost did not answer. Phone calls these days were usually salespeople or politicians or wrong numbers. The people who actually mattered to her rarely called anymore because she rarely answered. But something made her pick up. Maybe loneliness. Maybe the storm making her aware of how isolated she really was. David's number showed on the caller ID. Claire, her brother said when she answered, and his voice carried that edge of worry she had come to recognize over the past 2 years. The edge that said he was thinking about calling more often, checking on her more, maybe even flying out to visit. The edge that never quite translated into action, because David had his own life, his own problems, and a sister in Montana who insisted she was fine. "I saw the weather forecast," he continued. "It looks bad, really bad. Promise me you'll stay inside. Don't do anything stupid trying to save cattle or check fences or any of that ranch hero stuff Dad used to pull. Claire felt a flash of irritation. I've survived 37 Montana winters, David. I think I know how to handle a storm. Not alone, you haven't, he shot back, and there was real fear in his voice now. Dad always had ranch hands to help. You always had Dad. Or Michael. Now you're out there by yourself and you're telling me you know how to handle this. The mention of Michael stung more than David probably intended. Claire gripped the phone tighter, forced her voice to stay level. "I'll be fine," she said. David sighed, a sound that came through the phone heavy with frustration and love and helplessness. "I worry about you. Out there by yourself. What if something happens? What if you get hurt and there's no one to help? What if you're unconscious in a barn or stuck in a snowdrift or 1,000 other things that could go wrong when you're alone in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard?" "Then I get hurt," Claire said flatly. "Same as anyone else living out here. Same as Dad. Same as every rancher who's ever worked this land." "That's not an answer," David said. "That's not even a plan. That's just giving up. Accepting that bad things might happen and doing nothing to prevent them." "What do you want me to do?" Claire heard her voice rising, felt emotion cracking through the shell she usually kept in place. "Sell the ranch. Move to California. Get a job in an office somewhere and pretend I wasn't raised to do this. Pretend 3 generations of family history doesn't matter." "I want you to live," David said quietly. "I want you to have a life that's about more than just duty and legacy and honoring dead people who can't even appreciate your sacrifice. Dad wouldn't want this for you. He'd want you happy." "Dad's dead," Claire said, and the words came out harder than she meant them. "He doesn't get a vote anymore. And neither do you. This is my life, my choice." They talked for a few more minutes, the conversation circling familiar territory. David pushing her to leave, to start over, to choose something easier. Claire refusing, defending a choice she was not even sure she believed in anymore but could not seem to abandon. The argument was old, worn smooth by repetition. They both knew their lines. They both knew nothing would change. Claire ended the call feeling more alone than before she answered. She stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the weight of isolation press down on her like the snow pressing down on the roof. David was right about one thing. She was alone out here. If something happened, if she got sick or injured or died, it might be days before anyone noticed. Weeks maybe. Who would check? Who would care? She thought about her father dying in the north pasture, lying in the grass for 6 hours before she found him. She thought about Michael dying alone in a ravine, cold and broken, waiting for help that came too late. She thought about spending the next 30 years slowly turning into her father, working herself to death in service of land that would outlast her and forget her. The thought made her chest tight with something that might have been panic if she let it be. Claire set the phone down and walked through the house, checking windows, checking locks, making sure everything was secure. The house her great-grandfather had built, that her grandfather had expanded, that her father had maintained. Every room held memories. The kitchen where her mother had taught her to bake bread. The living room where they had gathered around the wood stove on winter nights. Her father's office, unchanged since the day he died, his reading glasses still on the desk where he had left them. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, boots heavy on the wooden steps. The storm was louder up here, the wind finding gaps around windows and making the whole structure groan. She thought about going to bed but knew she would not sleep. Too much adrenaline, too much uncertainty, too many thoughts she did not want to think alone in the dark. Instead, she went to the storage room at the end of the hall, the room where boxes of family history had accumulated over generations. Things too important to throw away, but not important enough to display. Documents and photographs and letters that told the story of her family's time on this land. Claire was not sure what made her pull down the box labeled in her father's handwriting Dad's personal, 1985. Curiosity, maybe. Or just a need to feel connected to something, to someone. To remember that she came from people who had survived hard things, who had built something that lasted. Inside, she found the accumulation of a year. Photographs of people and places she half recognized. Letters from friends and business associates. Newspaper clippings about cattle prices and weather patterns and local events. The ephemera of a life lived, carefully preserved by someone who understood that the small details mattered, that history was made of individual days and ordinary moments. She sorted through the contents slowly, handling each item with care. Here was a photo of her father with a prize bull at the county fair. Here was a letter from her grandfather offering advice about pasture rotation. Here was a receipt for equipment purchased and long since worn out. And then she found a photograph that stopped her cold. It showed two families at a summer picnic. The colors had faded with age, turning everything slightly sepia, but the details were clear enough. A younger James Whitmore, maybe 30 years old, his dark hair not yet touched with gray. He had his arm around Claire's mother, who held baby Claire in her arms. Claire could not have been more than a year old in the photo, chubby and happy, reaching for something outside the frame. Beside her parents stood another couple. The man was tall and lean, dressed in work clothes with a friendly face and eyes that crinkled at the corners. Written on the back in her father's handwriting was Tom Carmichael. The woman next to him was younger, maybe late 20s, pretty in a wholesome way, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Ruth Carmichael, the caption said. Between them was a toddler, a little girl maybe 3 years old, caught mid-laugh, her arms outstretched as if she had just been chasing someone or running towards something wonderful. Claire stared at the photograph, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her father and the Carmichaels together, not just together but clearly friends. The body language was relaxed, familiar. These were people who knew each other well, who were comfortable in each other's presence. The mothers were standing close enough that their shoulders touched. The fathers had the easy stance of men who had worked together, who trusted each other. She turned the photo over. On the back, in her father's distinctive handwriting, someone had written summer 1985. Whitmore and Carmichael families. Before the split. Before the split. Claire read the words 3 times, her mind trying to process their meaning. She had never known her father and the Carmichaels had any history beyond being neighbors who shared a property line. Her father had never mentioned them, not once in her entire life. The name Carmichael had been spoken maybe twice in this house, both times in passing reference to the ranch up north, and never with any particular warmth or interest. What split? When had it happened? Why? Claire dug deeper into the box, searching for answers. She found more photographs from what looked like the same time period. The two families at a Christmas gathering. Tom and James working together on a fence line, both men smiling despite the obvious exertion. Ruth and Claire's mother in a kitchen, cooking together, laughing at something outside the frame. The evidence was overwhelming. These families had not just been neighbors, they had been friends, close friends. The kind of friends who celebrated holidays together, who helped each other with ranch work, who let their children play together. Then she found the letter. The envelope was addressed to James Whitmore, dated March 1986. Inside, written on lined paper in a strong, angular hand, was a message that made Claire's chest tighten. Jim, I understand your position on the water rights. Business is business, as you say. The judge ruled in your favor, and that's the end of it legally. But our families were friends. I thought that mattered more than fence lines and dollars per acre. I thought 14 years of friendship counted for something. I won't contest your claim in court. I can't afford the lawyer fees, and we both know it. But don't expect Ruth and me at your table again. Don't expect our girls to play together. Some things can't be undone. Some choices have consequences that last. You won your water rights. You lost your friends. I hope it was worth it. Tom Carmichael. Claire read the letter 3 times, trying to understand. Her father and Tom Carmichael had been friends, close friends apparently, for 14 years. Their families had gathered together, had shared meals, had let their children play together. And then something about water rights had torn them apart. She found more documents, legal papers about a boundary dispute over a spring that fed both properties, court records showing that James Whitmore had sued for exclusive rights to the water. The judge had ruled in his favor. The spring and all its water belonged to Whitmore Ranch. Tucked between the legal documents was a journal entry in her father's handwriting, dated a few weeks after the court decision. Settled the water rights dispute with Tom Carmichael today. Judge ruled in my favor. The spring on the boundary line belongs to Whitmore Ranch. Legal victory, but it feels hollow. Tom and I built our ranches together back in '72. Our kids played together. Ruth was at every family dinner for 10 years. But business is business. That spring water is worth $50,000 a year in drought years. I need it to keep this ranch viable for Claire's future. I need to be able to guarantee water for my herd no matter what the weather does. Tom said I chose money over friendship. Maybe he's right, but I chose my daughter's inheritance. Someday Claire will understand. You make hard choices to protect family legacy. Tom will forgive me eventually. We're neighbors. We'll have to get along. Claire kept reading, found another entry dated a year later. Tom still won't speak to me. Ruth crosses the street when she sees me in town. I keep telling myself I did the right thing for Claire, for the ranch, but I miss my friend. The cost is higher than I thought it would be. Can't undo it now. She sat back on her heels, the journal in her hands, and tried to process what she was reading. Her father had carried this guilt his entire life. He had sacrificed friendship for water rights, had chosen the ranch over the people who mattered to him, and he had regretted it. But he had never tried to make it right. Pride, probably, or fear, or just the stubborn determination that characterized every Whitmore she had ever known. And now, 38 years later, the consequences of that choice were still rippling outward. Two families had spent 4 decades as strangers, living 12 miles apart but existing in separate worlds. Claire and Ruth had never known each other as children. They had never had the chance to be friends because of a decision made before either of them was old enough to understand what was being lost. Claire looked at the photograph again. 2 little girls, one about 3, one barely a year old. What had happened to Ruth's daughter? Had she left Montana like David, fled to somewhere bigger and easier? Was Ruth alone out there for the same reasons Claire was alone here, because the next generation had not wanted the burden of legacy? The wind howled outside, stronger now. Claire checked her watch. 7:30. The storm had arrived ahead of schedule. She went to the window and looked out at darkness and snow illuminated by the porch light. Already she could barely see past the fence line. By morning the world would be buried. She thought about Ruth Carmichael, 12 miles north, alone in a house with no phone service. She thought about the water rights that had seemed so important to her father, important enough to destroy a friendship over. She thought about the spring that fed both properties, about the arbitrary line someone had drawn on a map deciding who owned what. 38 years of separation over something that seemed petty now, standing in the face of isolation and approaching storm. Her father had died alone, working himself to death in service of the ranch he had fought to protect. If he had kept his friendship with Tom Carmichael, would someone have been there? Would he have had a neighbor who checked on him, who noticed when he did not come home? Claire pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made no decision. The storm was here. There was nothing to be done tonight regardless. Ruth Carmichael was a stranger, barely an acquaintance. Whatever happened at the Carmichael ranch was not Claire's responsibility. But as she turned away from the window, the photograph still in her hand, she could not shake the feeling that something was building out there in the darkness. Something more than weather. A choice approaching that would matter more than water rights or family grudges or the weight of legacy. The horses in the barn were calling to each other, their voices carrying on the wind. Claire listened to them and thought about what Charlie had said. Ruth's mare trying to go back to Whitmore Ranch for some reason. Horses remembering places. She set the photograph on the kitchen table where she would see it in the morning. Two families, two little girls, a friendship before the split. Evidence of what had been lost and what might have been different if different choices had been made. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Inside, Claire Whitmore sat alone with ghosts and regrets, and the question of whether this generation would repeat the mistakes of the last, or find the courage to choose differently. The wind howled. The snow fell. And 12 miles north, a woman Claire barely knew faced the night with no phone and no help, and no way of knowing whether anyone would think to check on her when the storm finally passed. Claire went to bed but did not sleep. She lay in the darkness and listened to the house groan under the assault of wind and weather. She thought about her father's journal entry. You make hard choices to protect family legacy. But what good was legacy if it left you dying alone? What was the point of protecting land and water rights if you had no one to share it with, no one who cared whether you lived or died? The questions circled in her mind like the snow circling outside. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, Claire Whitmore began to suspect that the storm coming was bringing more than snow. It was bringing a reckoning, a chance to break the cycle that had started 38 years ago with a court decision and a broken friendship. Whether she had the courage to take that chance remained to be seen, but the photograph on her kitchen table seemed to glow in her mind's eye. Two little girls who had never been given the chance to know each other. Two women who might have been friends if their fathers had chosen differently. She thought about Gunner and the other horses in the barn, warm and safe because she had prepared for them. She thought about Ruth's mare Rusty, trying to find her way back to the Whitmore ranch for reasons only the horse understood. She thought about animals knowing things that humans missed, sensing connections that pride and stubbornness had tried to sever. The wind screamed against the windows. The temperature continued to drop, and Claire lay awake in the darkness, suspended between the past and the future, between her father's choices and her own, between the safety of isolation and the risk of reaching out. By morning, the decision she had been circling would no longer be theoretical. By morning, the storm would have done its work, and Claire would have to choose whether to stay safe inside her walls or venture out into a world that might kill her to check on a woman she barely knew. The woman who might have been her friend, the woman whose father her father had betrayed, the woman who was, at that very moment, 12 miles north in the darkness, facing challenges Claire could not yet imagine. The storm raged, and in the morning everything would change. Ruth Carmichael woke at 4:30 that same November morning, the way she had woken every morning for 40 years. Her body knew the rhythm even when her mind wanted more sleep, even when the darkness outside her window was complete, and the cold made her bones ache in ways that got worse with every passing year. This was ranching time. Animals did not care about human comfort or the desire for another hour under warm blankets. Animals needed feeding at 5, whether you were 64 or 24, whether your joints protested every movement or you bounced out of bed ready for work. She lay still for a moment in the bed she had shared with Tom for 35 years, the bed where he had died 3 years ago, the bed that still felt too big even after all this time alone. The sheets on his side were cold, always cold, had been cold for 1,095 days now. Not that Ruth was counting, except she was, every single day. The alarm clock on the nightstand glowed 4:31. Ruth reached out and silenced it before it could ring, the way she always did. Tom used to tease her about that, setting an alarm she never needed, planning to wake up naturally and beating the clock every time. It was a rancher's superpower, he would say. The ability to wake before dawn no matter what, bodies programmed by decades of pre-sunrise work. Ruth missed his voice, missed the sound of another person breathing in the darkness, missed having someone to talk to about the weather or the cattle or the small victories and defeats that made up a life. She could talk to herself now, did talk to herself, but it was not the same as having someone who talked back, who cared about the answers, who shared the burden of knowing and caring and worrying. She dressed in layers in the unheated bedroom, her breath visible in the pale light that spilled from the hallway. The house was old, built in 1958 by Tom's parents, and the heating was minimal even when working properly. Ruth kept the thermostat at 60 to save money, wore extra layers to compensate. It was not about being poor. The ranch made enough to keep going. It was about being practical, about not wasting resources, about the habits of a lifetime lived close to the bone. Thermal underwear first, the high-tech kind that actually worked, not like the cotton long johns she had worn as a girl. Then jeans worn soft from years of work, the denim thin at the knees but still serviceable. Then a flannel shirt her husband Tom had worn until it became more hers than his through the simple fact of outliving him. She had stopped wearing it for a while after he died. The smell of him had faded, and that had broken her heart in a new way. But eventually she had started wearing it again because it was warm, and because some mornings she needed to feel close to him, even if it was just fabric and memory. Over that went a heavy canvas work coat that smelled of hay and horses and decades of Montana weather. The coat had been Tom's too. Everything she wore had belonged to him at some point. Ruth had not bought new clothes in years. What was the point when no one saw her? When the only beings who cared what she looked like were horses and cattle who measured her by the consistency of her feeding schedule, not the fashion of her attire. She pulled on wool socks, thick and warm, darned in places where holes had appeared. Her mother had taught her to darn socks, a skill that seemed quaint now in a world where people threw things away rather than mend them. But Ruth had lived through lean years when every dollar mattered, when you fixed what broke because buying new was not an option. The habit stayed even when the necessity faded. The insulated boots sat by the door where she left them every night, worn leather creased and stained but still waterproof, still functional. She laced them with fingers that moved slower than they used to, that ached in the cold no matter how many layers of gloves she wore later. Arthritis. The doctor in town had confirmed it last year during her annual checkup. Nothing to be done about it except over-the-counter pain medication, an acceptance that her body was wearing out. That 64 years of hard use had consequences. The kitchen was warmer than the bedroom, the wood stove she had fed before bed still holding heat from last night's fire. This stove was older than Ruth, installed when the house was built, cast iron and reliable in the way modern appliances never seemed to be. It heated the main floor, provided hot water through a coil system Tom had installed, and could cook meals when the power went out, which it did regularly in winter, often for days at a time. Ruth added kindling and a log, waited for the flames to catch, then put coffee on to brew. Not the fancy kind people drank in town, flavored and expensive. Just basic black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, the same brand she and Tom had been drinking since they got married in 1977. The smell filled the small house, rich and dark and comforting, one of the few pleasures Ruth allowed herself. She stood by the stove and wrapped her hands around the mug when it was ready, drawing warmth into her palms, into her chest, into the cold places that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of human connection. The coffee was too hot at first, scalding her tongue, but she drank it anyway. Pain was familiar. Pain was honest. Pain reminded her she was still alive even on the mornings when that felt more like curse than blessing. The radio on the shelf crackled with early morning news and weather. Ruth listened with half her attention while she planned her day. Storm coming, the forecaster said with that particular tone of urgency that meant this was serious. The system had intensified overnight. What had been forecast to arrive in the evening was now expected by mid-afternoon. Accumulation estimates had increased to 3 feet or more, wind speeds potentially reaching 70 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to 10 below zero before wind chill, which would make it feel like 30 or 40 below. This was dangerous weather, potentially deadly weather. The kind of storm that killed unprepared people, that stranded vehicles on highways, that collapsed barns and left ranchers fighting to save their herds. Ruth had lived through storms like this before, had survived the infamous blizzard of 1996 that buried the entire region under 5 feet of snow and killed hundreds of cattle across Montana. She knew what was coming. But knowing did not make it less daunting when you were alone. When you were the only person responsible for every animal, every structure, every task that needed doing. When there was no one to share the work, to take a shift, to check on you if you did not come back from the barn. Ruth had spent yesterday afternoon preparing, had done everything the way Tom taught her. The 4 horses in her small herd were already in the barn with extra hay and fresh water. The 30 head of cattle were in the sheltered draw on the east side of the property, where cottonwood trees and the lay of the land would give them protection from the worst wind. She had stacked firewood on the covered porch, had filled every container in the house with water in case the pipes froze or the pump lost power. She had checked the generator, made sure it had fuel, tested it to confirm it would start when needed. She had done this before. Weathered Montana storms alone for 3 years now, since Tom died and left her the sole caretaker of everything they had built together. She knew the routine, knew what needed doing, knew she was as prepared as one person could be. But something about this storm felt different, heavier somehow, more dangerous. The air had that quality it got before the worst weather, a kind of electric tension that made animals nervous and old injuries ache. Ruth's left knee, damaged in a fall from a horse 20 years ago, throbbed steadily, a deep bone ache that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. Her chest felt tight, constricted, but she attributed that to the cold and the tension and the anticipation of hard work ahead. She finished her coffee and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing her breath, making her eyes water instantly. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, burning her lungs with each inhalation. The wind was already building, coming down from the north with that particular bite that meant Canadian air, Arctic air, the kind of cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and kill through hypothermia in less than an hour if you were not careful. The thermometer by the barn door read 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before wind chill. Ruth did the math automatically, a calculation every rancher learned young. With wind at 20 miles per hour, which was light for what was coming, the wind chill was probably around zero. When the storm hit full force and the wind reached 50 or 60 miles per hour, the wind chill would drop to 40 or 50 below. Frostbite conditions. Dangerous to be outside at all. But the animals still needed care. Storm or no storm. That was the contract you made when you chose ranching. The animals depended on you. They could not feed themselves, could not shelter themselves, could not survive without human intervention. You did not get days off when the weather was bad. You worked harder on those days because the stakes were higher. The barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough that Ruth's breath fogged as she worked, cold enough that her fingers ached inside her gloves. The building was old, original to the property, built by Tom's grandfather in the 1940s. But it was solid, thick wooden walls chinked against the wind, a good roof that did not leak, stalls that had housed horses for 3 generations. Rusty, her chestnut mare, nickered softly when Ruth entered. The horse was 9 years old in her prime, with intelligent dark eyes and a calm disposition that had made her Ruth's favorite from the day they brought her home as a gangly 3-year-old. Tom had picked her out at an auction in Billings, had seen something special in the young mare that time proved correct. Rusty was steady and smart and willing, the kind of horse you could trust with your life. "Morning, girl," Ruth said quietly, her voice rough from sleep and disuse. The only voice she heard most days was her own, and she had taken to talking less and less because what was the point of speaking when no one listened? But the horses listened. Rusty especially seemed to understand, seemed to care in a way that made the loneliness bearable. "Cold one today, isn't it? Big storm coming. We'll need to hunker down and wait it out together." She moved through the familiar routine of feeding, her body knowing the motions even when her mind wandered. Hay into each stall, the sweet smell filling the barn. Water buckets checked and refilled from the pump that still worked, thank God, because if that froze they would have real problems. Each horse checked for any sign of injury or illness, hands running over legs feeling for heat or swelling, eyes examined for cloudiness, coats inspected for the subtle signs of distress that could mean colic or founder or any of the 100 things that could go wrong. Her small operation was manageable for one person. Barely. 4 horses, 30 cattle, 800 acres. Not the empire some ranches were, not the sprawling operations that employed dozens of hands and ran thousands of head of cattle. But enough. Enough to keep her connected to the land Tom had loved, to the life they had built together, to the legacy she could not quite bring herself to abandon even though everyone in town told her she should. "Sell," they said. "You're 64. You've earned rest. Move to town where there are people, where you're not so isolated, where someone would notice if you didn't show up for a few days. Get an apartment near the senior center. Make friends. Play bingo. Take up quilting. Live the life widows are supposed to live instead of wearing yourself out on a ranch that's too much work for one person." But Ruth could not do it. Could not imagine selling the land she and Tom had improved acre by acre over 40 years. Could not imagine strangers living in the house they had built, sleeping in the bedroom where Tom had died, sitting at the kitchen table where they had shared 40 years of meals and conversations and comfortable silences. This place was Tom, every fence post they had set together, every pasture they had seeded, every barn board they had nailed in place. Selling it would be like erasing him, like admitting that his life's work had not mattered enough to preserve. So Ruth stayed, and worked, and grew lonelier with each passing season, and told herself it was honoring Tom's memory when some part of her knew it was just fear. Fear of starting over, fear of admitting she could not do it alone, fear of discovering that without the ranch she was nobody, nothing, just an old woman with no purpose and no reason to get up at 4:30 in the morning. Ruth talked to Rusty as she worked, the way she had taken to doing since Tom died. The mare was the only one who listened without judgment, without advice, without the subtle implication that Ruth was foolish for clinging to a life that was killing her by degrees. "You know what everyone says," Ruth told the horse, running a brush over her gleaming coat, feeling the solid warmth of muscle and bone beneath her hands. "They say I should sell. Move to town. Get an apartment near the senior center where I can play bingo and complain about my health with other old women. They think I'm crazy staying out here." Rusty turned her head, dark eyes patient and understanding in a way that made Ruth's chest tight with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the particular loneliness of talking to an animal, because there were no humans left who cared. "But this is home," Ruth continued, her hand steady on the brush even as her voice wavered slightly. "Tom and I built this place from nothing. We were 24 years old when we bought it, just married, so much in love it hurt. We had 800 acres of grass and sagebrush and dreams. No house, no barn, nothing but land and hope and the stubborn belief that we could make something of it. The memories came in flashes. Tom at 24, lean and strong and full of energy, working 16-hour days to build the first small house, just 4 rooms, but it was theirs. Breaking horses to sell because they needed money, and breaking horses was something Tom could do that people would pay for. Her cooking for ranch hands during harvest season, feeding crews of men, saving every dollar to buy their first tractor, their first real cattle. The early years had been hard but happy. They were building something together. Every improvement to the ranch was a shared victory. Every setback was a shared burden. They had each other, and that had seemed like enough. More than enough. "We built every fence you see," Ruth told Rusty, still brushing, still needing to say these things out loud even if only a horse heard them. "Every building, every water line, 40 years of work. 40 years of Tom getting up before dawn and coming home after dark. How do I just walk away from that? How do I tell him I gave up?" The horse had no answer, of course. Just stood quietly accepting the grooming, the affection, the desperate need for connection that Ruth could admit to an animal but to no other living soul. Rusty's patience was infinite. Her judgment non-existent. She listened and she cared, and she never suggested that Ruth was making her life harder than it needed to be by refusing to let go. Ruth thought about Tom as she worked, the way she did every morning. 3 years since cancer took him, slow and mean and thorough. 2 years of watching him waste away, of holding his hand through chemo that made him sick but did not make him better, of nursing him at home because he refused to die in a hospital surrounded by strangers. She could still remember his last day with a clarity that time had not dimmed. November morning, not unlike this one. Tom in their bed, his body reduced to angles and hollows, his breathing shallow and labored. Ruth had sat beside him holding his hand, watching the sun rise through the bedroom window, knowing these were their last hours together. "Ruthie," he had whispered, his voice barely audible, "promise me something." "Anything," she had said, meaning it. "Promise me you won't stay out here alone forever. The ranch was our life together, but I'm going and you're staying. Don't let this place become a prison. Sell it. Move to town, be around people. You're only 61. You've got years left. Don't waste them being stubborn." Ruth had not been able to promise, could not form the words to tell the man she loved that she would abandon everything they had built, that she would walk away from 40 years of accumulated work and dreams and sweat. Tom had seen her hesitation, had squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. "This is our place," he had said. "Our life. Not just mine, not just yours, ours. And when I'm gone, it's just land, Ruthie, just dirt and grass and fences. Don't choose it over living." He had died that afternoon, the sun still high in a sky that had no right to be so beautiful when her world was ending. Ruth had held his hand as his breathing slowed, stopped, as the man she had loved for 35 years became just a body in a bed, something that looked like Tom but was not Tom, could never be Tom again. And she had kept the ranch, had told herself it was honoring his memory, preserving their legacy, staying true to the life they had chosen together. But on the hard mornings, the lonely evenings, the nights when the house felt too big and too empty, Ruth wondered if she had just been too afraid to start over, too proud to admit she could not do it alone, too stubborn to accept that sometimes love meant letting go. Ruth finished with the horses and stood in the barn doorway looking out at the gradually lightening sky. The sunrise was spectacular in that ominous way, painting clouds in shades of orange and purple that were too vivid, too saturated. Storm sky. The kind of beauty that came before violence. She thought about the photograph on her mantle, the one she looked at every morning. Tom and Sarah, their daughter, taken when Sarah was 16, before everything went wrong, before the arguments and the leaving and the long silence that ended in death. Sarah, the wound that never healed, the regret that would follow Ruth to her own grave. Ruth went back to the house and stood in front of the photograph, touching the frame with fingers that trembled slightly. Sarah at 16, all bright eyes and possibilities, her whole life ahead of her, beautiful in a way that transcended simple prettiness, smart in a way that had intimidated the small-town boys and frustrated the teachers who wanted her to be more conventional, ambitious in a way that had terrified her parents because they knew it meant losing her. The memory came whether Ruth wanted it or not. Sarah at 17, high school graduation day, cap and gown, scholarship to NYU for journalism. Ruth and Tom proud but heartbroken because they knew what that scholarship meant. Their daughter was leaving Montana, leaving the ranch, leaving the legacy they had assumed she would want. The argument that followed graduation had been bitter and painful, words spoken that could never be taken back. Tom telling Sarah she was abandoning her heritage, walking away from 4 generations of family land. Sarah shouting back that it was their dream, not hers, that she could not breathe in this place, that she would die of boredom and frustration if she stayed. Your great-grandfather broke this land, Tom had said, his voice hard with disappointment. 4 generations have kept it going. You're just going to walk away. Throw it all away for some fantasy about being a writer in New York. It's my life, Sarah had screamed, tears streaming down her face. Mine, not yours, not great-grandpa's. Mine, and I get to choose what I do with it. She had left in August of 1995, driven away in a borrowed car loaded with everything she owned, and the distance between them had grown from there. At first Sarah called every week, full of stories about the city and her classes and her new life. Ruth had tried to be supportive, had tried to be interested, but every story felt like evidence that they were losing their daughter to a world they did not understand. The phone calls became less frequent, once a month, then holidays only, then just Christmas cards with brief notes that revealed nothing of substance. Sarah married someone they never met, a man named David Foster, had a daughter they never saw, a little girl named Emma, built a life that had no room in it for aging parents on a Montana ranch. In 2012, after years of minimal contact, Sarah had called. Ruth could still remember the conversation, every word burned into her memory. "Mom," Sarah had said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation, "I'm getting divorced. It's been hard. I need to come home for a while just to rest, to figure things out. Can I bring Emma? She's 8. I want her to meet you and Dad." Of course, Ruth had said immediately, her heart leaping at the possibility of reconnection. "Of course, honey. This is always home. Come any time." Sarah had promised to call back with dates, had said she would drive out in a week, maybe 2, had sounded lighter, more hopeful than Ruth had heard her in years. But Sarah never made it home. 3 days later, the phone call from Pennsylvania State Police. Car accident on Interstate 80 outside Pittsburgh. Sarah dead at the scene. Emma physically unharmed but traumatized, going to stay with her father's family. Ruth had flown to Pennsylvania for the funeral, had met Emma for the first and only time at the service. A small blonde girl with Sarah's eyes, sitting between her paternal grandparents, looking lost and scared, and too young to understand that her mother was never coming back. Ruth had tried to talk to the Fosters, had suggested that Emma might visit Montana sometime, might want to know her maternal grandparents. But the Fosters had been polite and distant, clearly not interested in maintaining a connection. Ruth had flown home alone, sat in the empty ranch house, and felt the weight of all the years lost to pride and stubbornness, and the inability to accept that people could love the land without wanting to live on it. Tom had died a year later and Ruth had been alone since. No daughter, no granddaughter, no Tom, just the ranch and the memories and the crushing weight of regret. She stared at Sarah's photograph now, her chest tight with more than just the cold. Emma would be 12 now, almost 13, growing up in Philadelphia with people Ruth did not know, learning nothing about her mother's heritage, having no connection to the land that had shaped 4 generations of her family. Ruth had sent birthday cards every year, carefully chosen, with notes that tried to strike a balance between grandmother warmth and respectful distance. The cards were never returned, which Ruth took as permission to keep sending them. But Emma never responded, never wrote back, never acknowledged them. "I have a granddaughter I've never met," Ruth whispered to the photograph. "She's 12 years old and she's a stranger to me. My own flesh and blood. Because I was too proud to accept that Sarah needed something different. Because I let a ranch come between us." The pain in her chest intensified, a sharp pressure that made her breathe shallow. Ruth pressed a hand to her sternum, rubbing absently. Just tension. Just the grief that never quite went away no matter how much time passed. The ache of everything lost, everyone gone. She made herself move, forced herself back into the routine that kept her going. Fed herself breakfast she did not taste. Checked the wood stove. Looked out at the weather that was deteriorating faster than predicted. The snow had already started, light flakes that swirled in the growing wind. The forecast had said evening, but the storm was here now, hours early. Ruth thought about driving to town, calling the phone company again about the lines that had been down for 3 days. But the roads already looked dangerous, and getting caught in town during the storm was not an option. The animals needed her. The ranch needed her. She would have to wait it out, hope the phone company sent someone after the weather cleared. By noon the snow was falling steadily, and Ruth's chest pain was worse. Not just pressure now, but a sharp, radiating ache that spread down her left arm and up into her jaw. She sat in her kitchen chair and tried to breathe through it, tried to tell herself it was indigestion or stress or just old age catching up to her. But she knew. Her father had died of a heart attack at 62. She recognized the symptoms from watching him collapse in this same kitchen 30 years ago, clutching his chest, his face gray, his breathing labored. This was not stress. This was not indigestion. This was her heart failing. Ruth looked at the phone on the wall, dead and useless. Looked out the window at snow that was already obscuring the world beyond her porch. Looked at the truck keys hanging by the door. Could she drive? The nearest hospital was 40 miles away. The roads were probably already impassable. Even if she made it to the truck, even if she could drive through her pain, she would never make it 40 miles in these conditions. She was alone, completely alone, and she was dying. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, Ruth felt a strange calm settle over her. This was how it ended then. Alone in the house she and Tom had shared, on the ranch they had built together, dying of the same thing that killed her father. There was a symmetry to it, a kind of inevitability. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the pain became unbearable. Ruth made her way to the barn, each step an exercise in agony, her left arm numb, her breathing shallow and rapid. Rusty whinnied when she entered, sensing something wrong in the way animals always knew. Ruth leaned against the stall door, her vision graying at the edges, sweat running down her face despite the cold. She was out of time. She knew it with the certainty that came from a lifetime of understanding when things were past saving. But the thought of dying completely alone, of lying undiscovered for days or weeks until someone thought to check, was unbearable. The thought of Emma never knowing what happened to her grandmother, of the Fosters assuming Ruth had just stopped caring enough to send birthday cards, was worse. With trembling hands, Ruth found paper and pen in the tack room. The writing was difficult, her hand shaking so badly she could barely form letters. but she forced herself to focus, to get the essential information down while she still could. Help Ruth Carmichael, heart attack. Carmichael Ranch, 12 miles north of Whitmore Ranch on Old County Road 7. Cannot reach phone. Storm coming, sending my horse Rusty. She knows the way to Whitmore Place from last summer. Please help. Don't want to die alone. 2:47 p.m. Ruth read the note over, trying to think if there was anything else she needed to say. Her mind kept circling back to Emma, to the granddaughter she would never know, to the letter she had been drafting for weeks but had never found the courage to send. If someone found this note, would they contact Emma? Would they tell her that her grandmother had thought of her at the end? That Ruth's last coherent thoughts had been regret and love and the desperate wish for one more chance to make things right. But there was no room for that in the note. No time. The pain was crushing now, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Ruth sealed the note in the waterproof pouch she used for important documents when riding in bad weather. Her hands fumbled with the straps, with the tape, but she finally got it secured to Rusty's tail. The hardest part was leading Rusty out of the warm barn into the storm. The mare resisted, clearly confused, not wanting to leave when every instinct told her to shelter. Ruth had to force her, had to slap her flank harder than she ever had in 9 years of partnership. Go, she shouted, her voice breaking. Go to Whitmore, find help, go. Rusty ran, calling back desperately, torn between obedience and the need to stay with her person who was clearly in distress. Ruth watched the mare disappear into the swirling snow, watched until she could not see her anymore, and then turned back toward the barn. She made it just inside the door before her legs gave out, collapsed on the concrete floor, the cold seeping through her clothes, her chest a knot of agony that would not ease. She fumbled for the aspirin she kept in the first aid kit, managed to swallow 3 tablets dry. And then there was nothing to do but wait. Either Rusty would make it to the Whitmore Ranch or she would not. Either Claire Whitmore would care enough to come or she would not. Either help would arrive in time or Ruth would die here alone on the barn floor, another casualty of pride and isolation and the particular cruelty of loving land more than people. Ruth thought about Tom as the pain waxed and waned, thought about Sarah, thought about Emma growing up in Philadelphia never knowing that her grandmother had loved her, had thought about her every day, had mourned the relationship that should have been. I'm sorry, she whispered to the empty barn, to the ghosts of everyone she had lost. I'm so sorry for all of it, for being stubborn, for choosing the ranch over you, for not knowing how to let go. The hours crawled past. Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, her body going into shock, her mind playing tricks. She thought she heard Tom calling her, thought she saw Sarah standing in the barn doorway, 16 again, whole and alive and smiling. Thought she felt hands lifting her, voices telling her it would be okay. But when she forced her eyes open, the barn was empty. Just her and the cold and the sound of the storm outside growing stronger. Meanwhile, 12 miles south, Rusty ran through the building blizzard. The mare's powerful legs churned through snow that was already 6 inches deep and getting deeper. The wind tried to push her sideways, tried to turn her back, but Rusty had a mission now. Her person was in trouble. She needed help. And some deep instinct told her that help existed south, at the place where they had bought hay months ago, the place her person had seemed happy for a brief moment. The journey that would have taken 30 minutes in good weather took hours in the storm. Rusty navigated by memory and instinct, by landmarks that were mostly invisible in the whiteout conditions but that she sensed anyway. The frozen creek she had crossed before, the ridge that blocked the wind, the draw where cattle sometimes sheltered. Several times she stopped, confused, the trail lost in the blowing snow. But each time she found it again, driven by something more powerful than fear or exhaustion. Loyalty, love, the bond between horse and human that transcended language and understanding. By the time she reached the Whitmore ranch, Rusty was coated in ice and snow, her flanks heaving, foam covering her chest despite the freezing temperature. But she was there. She had made it. Help was possible now. She ran to the house, calling desperately. The only voice she had, hoping someone would hear, someone would understand. Inside, Claire Whitmore heard the desperate whinnying over the sound of the storm. She went to the window, saw the strange horse in her driveway, and felt something shift in her chest. This was not random. This was not accident. This was the universe giving her a chance to choose differently than her father had chosen. She ran outside into the storm, fighting the wind with every step, reached the horse, saw the halter tag that said Rusty, Carmichael Ranch, saw the waterproof pouch attached to the mare's tail. With shaking hands, Claire opened the pouch and read the note, and felt her world tilt on its axis. Ruth Carmichael was dying, had been dying for hours now, alone, 12 miles away, had sent her horse through a blizzard with nothing but hope and a desperate note. Claire looked at Rusty, at the exhaustion and determination in the mare's eyes, looked at the note, at the shaky handwriting that spoke of pain and fear and the terrible loneliness of dying alone, looked toward the north where the storm raged and Ruth waited, hoping someone would care enough to come. Every rational part of Claire's brain said this was suicide, that going out in these conditions would kill her, that she had no responsibility to a woman she barely knew, no obligation to risk her life for someone who was probably already dead. But she thought about her father dying alone in a field, undiscovered for hours, thought about Michael dying alone in a ravine, cold and broken, thought about the photograph on her kitchen table, two families who should have been there for each other but were kept apart by pride. Thought about the journal entry she had read just hours ago. Tom will forgive me eventually. We're neighbors. He can't avoid me forever. But Tom had avoided him, had chosen to carry the hurt rather than forgive. And both men had died alone, separated by a grudge over water rights that mattered less with every passing year. Claire made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She would go. She would take her strongest horse and she would let Rusty lead them back. A horse could navigate terrain that would stop a vehicle, and Rusty clearly knew the way home. It was insane, reckless, exactly the kind of decision that got people killed in Montana winters. And it was the only choice Claire could live with. She ran to the barn, saddled Gunner with hands that shook from adrenaline and cold, packed her saddlebags with everything she could think of. First aid kit with nitroglycerin and aspirin, emergency blankets, chemical hand warmers, flashlight, rope, every supply that might mean the difference between life and death. She dressed in her warmest layers, thermal underwear, fleece, heavy winter coat, scarf wrapped around her face, insulated gloves with hand warmers inside, hat pulled low. She left a detailed note on her kitchen table. If she died tonight, at least someone would know where and why. At least her choice would be documented. Then she picked up the photograph from the table. Two families, two little girls before the split. She put it in a waterproof pocket inside her coat. If she made it to Ruth, if the woman was still alive, Claire wanted her to see this. Wanted her to know that someone remembered what had been lost. That someone cared enough to try to bridge the gap. Claire led Gunner and Rusty out into the storm. The world had disappeared into white chaos. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. Temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. Wind was sustained at 50 miles per hour with gusts that nearly knocked her over. This was madness. This was certain death. This was the right thing to do. Claire mounted Gunner and gave Rusty her head. The mare moved forward immediately, pulling against the lead rope, desperate to get home to the woman who needed her. And Claire followed, committing herself to the storm, to the journey, to the choice that would define who she was and who she might become. Behind her, the lights of her ranch disappeared into the whiteout. Ahead was nothing but snow and wind and darkness. And 12 miles away, Ruth Carmichael lay on a cold barn floor, her heart struggling, her breathing shallow, waiting for help that might never come, waiting to discover if the daughter of her husband's lost friend cared enough to answer a desperate mare's call. The storm raged. The horses moved forward, and two women who barely knew each other but were bound by their father's choices began a convergence that would change both their lives forever. The world disappeared the moment Claire rode beyond the light of her porch. 1 second she could see the fence line, the familiar white boards that marked the boundary of her property, the shape of her barn solid against the sky, the gate posts she had ridden past 10,000 times. The next second there was nothing but white. Snow falling so thick it was like riding through a wall, through clouds made solid, through a space where direction lost all meaning, and the only reality was cold and wind, and the darkness between snowflakes that seemed to hold some malevolent intelligence. Claire leaned forward in the saddle, trying to protect her face from the worst of the wind, pressing herself against Gunner's neck to create the smallest possible profile. But there was no protection. The storm came from everywhere at once. It pushed from the north with sustained force that made Gunner lower his head and fight for every step, his muscles bunching and releasing under Claire as he struggled forward. It gusted from the sides with sudden violence that nearly unseated her, that made her grip the saddle horn with both hands and pray her frozen fingers did not slip. It swirled and eddied in patterns that defied prediction, sometimes easing for a heartbeat that made her think the worst was passing before returning with doubled fury that stole her breath and made her doubt whether survival was even possible. The temperature was 10 below 0 Fahrenheit according to the thermometer she had checked before leaving, her breath freezing on the glass as she leaned close to read it. With wind at 50 miles per hour, maybe 60 in the gusts that threatened to knock Gunner sideways, the wind chill was somewhere around 40 below, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in less than 5 minutes. Cold enough to kill through hypothermia in less than an hour if you were not moving, not generating heat, not fighting back against the relentless theft of warmth from any living thing foolish enough to be outside. Claire wore every layer she owned, had dressed with the methodical care of someone who understood that each piece of clothing might mean the difference between life and death. Thermal underwear against her skin, the high-tech kind that wicked moisture away from the body. Fleece over that, thick and warm, trapping air in its fibers. Heavy winter coat over the fleece, rated for -40, filled with down that compressed under her movements and expanded again to hold warmth. Scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes were exposed, and even those watered constantly from the cold and the wind, tears freezing on her eyelashes and making it hard to blink. Insulated gloves with chemical hand warmers pressed against her palms, the warmers activated just before she left, generating heat through chemical reaction. Wool hat pulled low under the hood of her coat, covering her ears, protecting her head where so much body heat escaped. She had dressed for survival, prepared for the worst conditions she could imagine based on a lifetime of Montana winters. It was not enough. The cold found its way through every layer, every gap, every place where fabric met skin or where movement created openings. Her face went numb within minutes despite the scarf, the exposed skin around her eyes going white with frostbite that she could feel even through the numbness. Her fingers ached despite the gloves and the warmers, a deep bone pain that made gripping the reins an exercise in will. Her toes began to lose feeling inside boots she knew were rated for -40, boots that cost $300 and were supposed to keep her feet warm in any weather Montana could produce. But she kept riding because Rusty was pulling forward, because the mare knew where to go even when Claire was completely disoriented, because 12 miles north, a woman was dying and Claire had made a choice. The only choice she could live with. The choice that defined who she wanted to be versus who she had been becoming in her isolation. Gunnar followed Rusty steadily, the stallion's powerful body moving with the careful precision of a horse that understood the danger, that knew one misstep could mean death for himself and the human who depended on him. Claire could feel his attention focused on every step, every placement of his hooves on ground made treacherous by snow that hid ice and rocks and holes. His ears swiveled constantly, listening to the wind, to Rusty ahead, to Claire's breathing and the small sound she made. He was alert in a way that went beyond training, tapping into the survival instincts that had kept horses alive for millions of years in environments just as hostile as this. Claire had tied Rusty's lead rope to her saddle horn with a knot Tom had taught her father decades ago, a knot designed to hold under pressure, but that could be released with one pull if necessary. The connection between the two horses was literal now, a physical tether that would keep them together even if visibility dropped to nothing. Already she could barely see the mare ahead of her, just a dark shape moving through the white, pulling them forward with desperate determination born of love and loyalty, and the bond between horse and human that transcended language. The first hour passed in a kind of dreamlike struggle. There was no sense of progress, no way to measure distance covered. The world had contracted to the space immediately around Claire and the horses, 10 feet of visibility if they were lucky, 5 feet more often. Sometimes less than that, the snow so thick she could not see Rusty at all and had to trust the tension on the lead rope to tell her the mare was still there, still leading them north. Claire tried to track time by her watch, but the simple act of pushing back her sleeve to look at the glowing dial required exposing her wrist to the cold, pulling off her glove for just the 3 seconds it took to check the time. After the second time, when she realized her wrist had gone white with frostbite in those brief seconds of exposure, she stopped checking. Time had become meaningless anyway. There was only the eternal present of cold and wind and movement, the endless struggle forward that might go on for hours or might end in the next minute when her body finally gave out. She thought about Michael to keep her mind sharp, to fight the numbness that was both physical and mental, to remind herself why human connection mattered enough to risk dying for it. Michael, at 28 when they first met, brought out to the Whitmore ranch because one of her horses was colicking and the regular vet was on vacation somewhere warm. She had expected someone older, more established, someone who looked like the country vets she had grown up with. Instead, she got a young veterinarian with kind eyes and gentle hands who knelt in the straw beside her suffering mare and worked for 3 hours straight to save the animal's life. He had been methodical and patient, checking vitals, administering medications, walking the horse when she needed to move, massaging her belly when the pain made her try to roll. Claire had watched him work and seen competence and compassion in equal measure. When the horse finally passed manure and the crisis eased, when it became clear the mare would survive, Michael had stood up and stretched his back and smiled at Claire with genuine joy. "She's going to be fine," he had said. "You caught it early. That made all the difference." "Thank you," Claire had managed. "I don't know what I would have done if she died." "You would have survived," Michael said simply. "We always do, but I'm glad we could save her together." Then, still covered in straw and manure and sweat from the exertion, he had asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime. Not as payment for his services, not as a professional courtesy, just because he wanted to know her better. Their first date had been at the only diner in town, nothing fancy, just coffee and pie and conversation that flowed like they had known each other for years instead of hours. Michael told her about growing up in Billings, the son of 2 teachers who had wanted him to go into academia. He told her about choosing veterinary medicine because he loved animals more than he loved people, about the way horses in particular seemed to understand human emotion in ways that transcended species. He told her about wanting to work in rural areas where vets were desperately needed instead of the city where the money was better, but the work felt less meaningful. Claire told him about the ranch, about her father's expectations that she would take over and preserve the legacy, about feeling trapped sometimes by the weight of 3 generations of Whitmore history, even as she loved the land with an intensity that surprised her. She told him about losing her mother at 15, about her brother David leaving for California and never looking back, about the loneliness of running a ranch that required more hands than she had. Michael had understood in a way most people did not, had not tried to fix her or change her mind or suggest she was making her life harder than it needed to be, had just listened and nodded and said that loving something complicated did not make you weak, it made you human, said that the best things in life were usually complicated. That simple was overrated. They dated for 6 months before Michael asked her to marry him, not in a restaurant or on some planned romantic getaway with reservations and flowers, just on horseback on a winter day, riding the fence line together, checking for damage after a December storm. The landscape had been covered in fresh snow, pristine and beautiful, the kind of beauty that only existed in Montana when the weather cleared after a blizzard and the sun came out and the world looked new. Michael had reined his horse to a stop at the top of a ridge where you could see for miles in every direction, mountains to the west, grassland to the east, sky so blue it hurt to look at. Claire had stopped beside him, wondering why he had chosen this spot. "Claire Whitmore," Michael had said, reining his horse to a stop, "will you build a life with me in this beautiful, brutal place?" She had said yes without hesitation, had known from the first month that this was the man she wanted to spend her life with, the man who understood that she came as a package deal with 3,000 acres and a legacy she could not abandon, the man who was willing to merge his veterinary practice with her ranching operation and build something together. 3 months later he was dead, killed by ice on a mountain pass while trying to help someone else's animal, gone between one heartbeat and the next, leaving Claire with a ring on her finger and a future that would never happen and a grief so vast it had nearly drowned her. The memory sharpened her focus now, pulled her back from the edge of hypothermia's seductive drowsiness. Michael had died trying to help. That was who he was. The kind of person who drove through bad weather because an animal needed him, because a rancher was desperate, because helping was what you did even when it was dangerous. Claire was riding through a blizzard for the same reason, because Ruth Carmichael needed help, because a desperate woman had sent her horse through a storm trusting that someone would care, because helping was what separated humans from the animals that simply survived, that looked after only themselves. The second hour was worse than the first. The temperature dropped further. The wind increased. Visibility degraded from poor to nearly zero. Several times Claire lost sight of Rusty completely, saw nothing ahead but white, and had to trust the lead rope to tell her the mare was still there. They came to a creek, frozen but treacherous. The horses stopped at the edge, Rusty whinnying nervously. Claire dismounted, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. She had been in the saddle for over an hour and her body had stiffened in the cold, muscles seizing up, joints refusing to bend properly. She walked forward carefully, testing the ice, heard it groan under her weight but hold. The creek was maybe 20 feet across. They would have to cross. There was no way around, not in these conditions with visibility this poor. Claire led Gunner forward, talking to him constantly, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was racing. The stallion trusted her, followed her onto the ice. She could hear it creaking, could feel it flex under the combined weight of horse and human, but it held. They were halfway across when the ice made a sound like a gunshot, a crack that echoed even over the wind. Gunner spooked, tried to rear. Claire held tight to the reins, pulling him forward, urging him to keep moving. If they stopped now, if his weight concentrated in one spot, the ice might give way entirely. "Keep going," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Almost there, keep going." The stallion lunged forward, his hooves scrambling for purchase on the slick surface. Another crack, another, but they made it to the far bank, both of them trembling, both of them alive. Rusty crossed next, lighter and more sure-footed, but still dangerous. The mare made it across and immediately pressed close to Gunner, both horses seeking comfort in each other's presence. Claire remounted, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the saddle horn. That was close, too close, and they had miles yet to go. The third hour brought the first real signs of hypothermia. Claire's thinking began to slow, thoughts becoming sticky and hard to hold. She caught herself forgetting where she was going, why she was out in this storm. Then the memory would return, Ruth dying alone, and she would force herself to focus. But it was getting harder. The cold was winning, leaching away her body heat faster than she could generate it through movement. Her core temperature was dropping. She could feel it in the way her shivering had become less violent, less frequent. That was bad. Shivering was the body's way of generating heat. When shivering stopped, it meant the body was giving up, shutting down. Claire started talking out loud, forcing words past lips that were numb and clumsy. Needed to hear her own voice, needed to stay alert. She talked to the horses, to herself, to Michael and her father and anyone who might be listening. "Keep moving," she said, "just keep moving. One step at a time. 1 minute at a time, don't stop. Stopping means dying." She began to hallucinate. Saw Michael riding beside her on his own horse, smiling at her through the snow. "Almost there," he said. "You're doing great, just a little further." She knew it was not real. Knew her brain was playing tricks as it lost oxygen, as her blood slowed in her veins. But the hallucination was comforting anyway, made her feel less alone in the white chaos. Then the hallucination changed. Michael's smile faded. He looked concerned, worried. "Claire, you need to stay awake. Don't close your eyes. That's hypothermia talking. You close your eyes out here, you don't open them again." "I'm so tired," she heard herself say. "I know, but you can't stop. Ruth is counting on you. You made a promise, you keep your promises." The hallucination faded. Claire blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. Realized she had been drifting, eyes half closed, body swaying in the saddle. She sat up straighter, forced herself alert. Paradoxical undressing. She remembered from the wilderness first aid course she had taken years ago. One of the final stages of hypothermia. The body's thermoregulation breaking down, sending false signals that you were too hot instead of freezing to death. People in the final stages of hypothermia often stripped off their clothes, convinced they were overheating. They were found frozen and naked, dead from the very thing they thought they were escaping. Claire checked her coat, made sure all the zippers were still closed, made sure she had not started removing layers without realizing it. Everything was still in place, but the fact that she had to check, that her mind was unreliable enough to consider it, terrified her. The fourth hour brought complete disorientation. Claire had no idea if they were going the right direction. Everything looked the same in every direction, white and wind and darkness. Rusty was still pulling forward, still moving with purpose, but what if the mare was lost too? What if they were going in circles or heading the wrong way entirely? Then Rusty stopped, simply stopped moving forward, planted her feet, refused to go further. Claire dismounted again, stumbled forward to see what had stopped the mare, and nearly stepped off the edge of a ravine. The drop was maybe 15 feet, steep and rocky, hidden by the snow until you were right on top of it. If Rusty had not stopped, if Claire had been riding alone, she would have ridden right over the edge. Would have fallen, would have injured or killed Gunner, would have died in the bottom of a ravine while the storm buried them. The horse had saved her life. Claire stood at the edge, heart pounding, and put her hand on Rusty's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "Good girl, smart girl, thank you." They had to go around the ravine, had to backtrack and find another way. The detour added at least 30 minutes, maybe more, time they did not have, but there was no choice. As they navigated the ravine's edge, searching for a way down, Claire saw a shape through the snow. A structure, small and dark and solid in a world of white chaos. She rode closer, hope and fear warring in her chest. If this was the Carmichael ranch, they had made it, but they could not have covered 12 miles yet, could they? As she approached, details resolved. Not a house, too small, a lined shack, one of the small emergency shelters that ranchers built at strategic points on their land, places where someone caught by weather could wait out the storm. Claire dismounted and tried the door. Unlocked. Thank God. She led both horses into the small space, which was barely big enough for all of them but was blessedly out of the wind. The temperature inside was maybe 20 degrees warmer than outside. Not warm by any reasonable standard, but after hours in 40 below wind chill, it felt like summer. Claire's body started shaking violently as it realized it was not about to die, as her muscles tried to generate heat again. She found a wood stove, old but functional, found firewood stacked against one wall. With shaking hands that barely worked, she built a fire, kindling first, then small pieces of wood. It took 3 tries to get the match lit, her fingers so numb they could barely hold it. But finally the kindling caught. The fire grew. Heat began to fill the small space. Claire collapsed on the floor near the stove, too exhausted to stand. She needed to rest, just for a few minutes, 20 minutes maybe, warm up enough to continue, check on the horses, then keep going. As her body thawed, pain arrived. Her fingers and toes burned as blood flow returned. Her face felt like someone was stabbing it with needles as sensation came back. She welcomed the pain. Pain meant the tissue was still alive, still salvageable. Frostbite victims who felt nothing were the ones who lost fingers and toes and noses. When she could move her hands again, Claire explored the lined shack. There was not much. The wood stove, a small supply of firewood and kindling, some basic tools, canned food on a shelf, expired but probably still edible, a water pump that was frozen solid, and a guest book in a waterproof box on a small table. Claire opened the box, curious. Inside was a notebook, weathered but carefully preserved. She opened it and began to read. The entries spanned decades. Ranchers who had sheltered here during storms, hunters caught by unexpected weather, travelers who had gotten turned around and found refuge. Each entry was dated, signed, sometimes with a brief note about conditions or gratitude for the shelter. 1967. Bob Henderson sheltered here during March blizzard with 2 ranch hands. Storm lasted 3 days. Cabin saved our lives. 1979. Maria Gonzalez and family. Car broke down, walked 2 miles to find this place. Stayed 2 nights until road cleared. Thank you to whoever maintains this shelter. 1983. James Whitmore. Storm caught me checking fence line, stayed 18 hours. Thanks to whoever maintains this place. You saved me today. Claire's breath caught. Her father. Her father had sheltered here 43 years ago, had written in this same book, had survived because someone, some rancher she would never know, had built this shelter and kept it stocked. She kept reading, her heart beating faster. 1989. Tom Carmichael, fixed stove chimney, left extra wood. Stay safe, neighbors. Tom Carmichael, Ruth's husband. The man her father had betrayed, had sued, had lost, and he had maintained this shelter, had fixed it, had left supplies, had written "Stay safe, neighbors," not "Stay safe, friends." The friendship was already broken by then, 3 years after the water rights dispute. But Tom Carmichael had still maintained the shelter, still left it ready for whoever might need it, still cared about the community even when individuals within it had hurt him. Claire kept reading, each entry a small window into the lives of people she had never met, would never meet, but who were connected by this place, by the understanding that helping strangers survive was just what you did in country this hard. 2015. Ruth Carmichael, ice storm, stayed 2 nights, fixed roof leak, thinking of Tom. Ruth, alone by then, Tom 3 years dead, still maintaining the shelter her husband had cared for, still making sure it was ready for the next person who needed it, still honoring the code of mutual aid that kept isolated communities alive. And then Claire found an entry that made her start crying, tears freezing on her cheeks as soon as they formed. 2022. Michael Torres, emergency vet called during storm, horse colicking at Carmichael Ranch, stayed here waiting out the worst of it, used the time to stabilize the horse. Got to meet Ruth Carmichael when I finally made it to her place. Tough lady, gentle with animals, reminds me of Claire, made it home safe. Thank you for this shelter. It matters. Michael, 2 years ago, just months before he died, he had been to Ruth's ranch, had met her, had thought she was like Claire, had sheltered in this same cabin, had probably sat on this same floor, had written in this book. Claire traced his handwriting with her finger, the familiar loops and slants she knew so well. This was one of the last things Michael had written, a note of gratitude in a guest book that no one would read unless they were desperate enough to need shelter. She understood now why Rusty had tried to return to the Whitmore ranch. The mare remembered Michael, remembered him coming to help when she was sick, remembered his kind hands and gentle voice. Horses had long memories. Rusty had been trying to bring them to the place where help lived, where the kind vet who had saved her life had come from. Claire dried her eyes and added her own entry to the book. Her hands shook, partly from cold, partly from emotion. November 2024. Claire Whitmore, on the way to help Ruth Carmichael, heart attack, sending this message in case I don't make it back. Tell David I love him. Tell Ruth she's not alone. Someone came. The line shack tradition saved me tonight. I'll keep it going. Thank you to everyone who maintained this place over the decades. Community saves lives. She signed it, dated it, closed the book carefully. Then she stood and checked on the horses. Both were warming up, eating from the emergency grain she found in sealed containers. They could not stay long. Every minute that passed was a minute Ruth was dying. But they needed this rest, needed to warm up enough to survive the rest of the journey. Claire gave herself 20 minutes by the fire, fed the horses, gave them water from melted snow, let her body recover enough core temperature to continue. She knew she was still hypothermic, knew her judgment was impaired, knew this whole enterprise was probably suicide. But Ruth was still out there, still waiting, still hoping. At the 20-minute mark, Claire banked the fire, left the woodbox restocked from the reserve pile, and led the horses back out into the storm. It seemed worse now after the brief respite. The wind had strengthened. The snow fell even harder. The darkness was complete. But they were maybe 4 miles from the Carmichael Ranch if Claire's dead reckoning was anywhere close to accurate. 4 miles. They could do 4 miles. They had to. The 5th hour was the hardest yet. Claire was beyond exhaustion, beyond cold, operating on nothing but will and stubbornness. She could barely stay in the saddle, kept jerking awake to realize she had been drifting, eyes closed, body swaying, while Gunner continued to follow Rusty through the storm. She hallucinated Michael again, riding beside her. This time he did not speak, just rode quietly, his presence a comfort even though she knew he was not real, could never be real again. Then she hallucinated her father, James Whitmore on his favorite horse, looking at her with that expression of pride and concern he had worn so often. "You're doing what needs doing," her father said in the hallucination. "That's all anyone can ask. You keep going, Claire. You finish what you start." "I'm tired, Dad," she said out loud, "so tired." Tom Carmichael was a good man, her father's hallucination said. "I should have found a way to work it out. Should have valued the friendship over the water. I was wrong. You're fixing what I broke. That matters." The hallucination faded. Claire blinked hard, fighting to stay conscious. Her body wanted to sleep so badly it hurt. Just close her eyes, just rest for a minute. The cold would take her gently. They said hypothermia was a peaceful way to die, like falling asleep. No, she could not stop, would not stop. Ruth needed her. The universe had given Claire a chance to choose differently than her father had chosen. She would not waste it. Then Rusty's behavior changed. The mare's pace quickened. She started calling out, her voice desperate and urgent even over the wind. Claire strained her eyes against the snow and thought she could see something ahead, a darker mass against the white. Buildings. It had to be buildings. Rusty broke into a stumbling trot, pulling Gunner along. Both horses were exhausted, their legs shaking, their breathing labored. But the mare knew she was close to home, close to her person. She had enough left to run. The Carmichael ranch materialized out of the storm like something from a fever dream, like a mirage that Claire half expected to vanish when she got closer. A small house, weathered clapboard that had once been white but was now faded to gray, windows dark, no smoke from the chimney. A barn that looked older than the house, probably built first when the property was homesteaded, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of accumulated snow. A couple of outbuildings, one that might be a workshop, another that was probably storage. Everything covered in snow that was already drifted 3 feet deep in places, everything dark and silent but real, solid, there. Rusty ran directly to the barn, calling out desperately, her voice hoarse from hours of running through the cold. The mare was at the end of her strength, her legs shaking, her breathing labored, foam covering her chest despite the freezing temperature. But she had made it, had led Claire through 12 miles of blizzard, through whiteout conditions that should have been impossible to navigate, through cold that should have killed them both. She had brought help home to the woman who needed her. Claire tried to dismount and her legs gave out completely. She fell to her knees in snow that came up to her thighs, so exhausted that for a moment she could not remember how to stand. Her body had been in survival mode for hours, running on adrenaline and will, and now that she was here, now that the immediate danger of the journey was past, everything was shutting down at once. She used Gunner's saddle to pull herself upright, her arms shaking with the effort. The stallion stood rock steady, understanding somehow that she needed his solidity, his strength. Claire got her feet under her and stood swaying, the world tilting around her. "Get to Ruth," she told herself. "You came all this way. Don't give up now when you're here, just a few more steps." She tied both horses to the fence rail near the barn, knowing she needed to get them into shelter, but also knowing with crystal clarity that Ruth came first. The woman had been dying for hours now, since 2:47 according to the note's timestamp. It was past 8 at night now. More than 5 hours Ruth had been alone with her failing heart, hoping help would come, not knowing if it would arrive in time. Every second counted. Every minute Ruth's heart went without proper treatment was a minute more damage was done, more heart muscle died, more chance of complete failure. Claire stumbled to the barn door, fighting through snow that had drifted against it. The door was heavy, old wood swollen from moisture, and it took all her remaining strength to pull it open against the wind and the accumulated snow. She stepped inside, and for a moment stood blind in the darkness, her flashlight somewhere in her saddlebag, her eyes not yet adjusted from the white of the storm. Then she fumbled the flashlight out, clicked it on with fingers that barely worked. The beam cut through the darkness, showing stalls and hay and farm equipment, and there, just inside the door, a shape on the floor that could only be a human being. Ruth Carmichael lay collapsed on the concrete floor just inside the barn door, maybe 5 feet from the entrance, as if she had tried to get back to the house after sending Rusty, but her body had given out before she made it. She was unconscious, her face gray in the flashlight beam, her skin slick with sweat that had frozen in the cold. Her breathing was so shallow that Claire almost thought she was not breathing at all, that she had arrived too late, that Ruth had died minutes or hours ago, and all this struggle had been for nothing. But when Claire dropped to her knees beside the older woman and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, there was a pulse, weak, irregular, skipping beats in a pattern that Claire knew meant serious cardiac trouble, but present. Ruth was alive, barely, hanging on by pure stubbornness and the animal will to survive. Ruth, Claire said, her voice coming out hoarse and cracked from hours of breathing cold air. Ruth Carmichael, my name is Claire Whitmore. Rusty brought me. I'm here. You're not alone anymore. Ruth's eyes fluttered open, the lids moving with visible effort, her gaze unfocused and confused. It took her several seconds to register Claire's presence, to understand that someone was actually here. When understanding came, tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, freezing almost immediately on her skin. Claire, she whispered, her voice barely audible, each word requiring obvious effort. Jim's daughter, you came. I came, Claire said, pulling off her gloves with shaking hands so she could assess Ruth properly. I came as fast as I could. You're going to be okay now. I've got medical supplies. I'm going to take care of you. You shouldn't have, Ruth managed. Storm, you could have died. But I didn't, Claire said firmly. And neither are you going to. Not today, not alone. I won't allow it. She opened her saddlebag with fingers that were clumsy from cold and exhaustion, dumped the contents onto the floor beside Ruth. First aid kit, emergency blankets, chemical hand warmers, everything she had brought for exactly this situation, even though part of her had not believed she would actually make it here. Her first aid training kicked in, the courses she had taken years ago coming back in a rush of remembered procedures and protocols. ABC. Airway, breathing, circulation. Ruth's airway was clear. Her breathing was shallow but present. Her circulation was the problem. Heart not pumping effectively. Cardiac output dropping. Blood pressure probably dangerously low. Claire found the nitroglycerin tablets in her first aid kit. The same tablets she had kept for her father when his heart had started giving him trouble years before his death. She placed one under Ruth's tongue, the tiny pill that could dilate blood vessels and improve blood flow to the damaged heart muscle. Let this dissolve under your tongue, she said. Don't swallow it, just let it sit there. Ruth nodded fractionally, understanding despite her confusion and pain. Claire checked her watch. The tablet would take effect in 1 to 3 minutes if it was going to work. Meanwhile, she needed to do everything else she could to stabilize the woman. She pulled the emergency blankets from her pack, the space-age material that reflected body heat back to the person wrapped in it. Carefully, gently, she wrapped Ruth in layer after layer, trying to combat the shock and hypothermia that were compounding the cardiac emergency. The barn was freezing, maybe 20 degrees, and Ruth had been lying on concrete for hours. Her core temperature had to be dangerously low. Claire activated chemical hand warmers and tucked them around Ruth's body, under her arms, in her groin, places where the warmth would reach major blood vessels and be carried throughout her system. She found more blankets in the barn, horse blankets that smelled of animal but were thick and warm, and piled those on top of the emergency blankets. How long? Ruth whispered after a minute. Her voice was slightly stronger. The nitroglycerin might be working, since Rusty left. About 3 hours to reach me, Claire said. Then 5 more hours to get here. 8 hours total, maybe a little less. 8 hours, Ruth repeated. Her eyes closed. Didn't think I'd last that long. But you did, Claire said. You're tougher than you think. She checked Ruth's pulse again. Still weak, still irregular, but maybe a tiny bit stronger. Hard to tell. Cardiac emergencies were notoriously unpredictable. Ruth needed an operating room, needed cardiac surgeons, needed interventions Claire could not provide in a freezing barn in the middle of a blizzard. But Claire could keep her alive until help was possible, could monitor her, could treat the symptoms even if she could not fix the underlying problem. That would have to be enough. Is there aspirin in the house? Claire asked. Ruth's note said she had taken some, but more might help. Bathroom, Ruth managed. Medicine cabinet. I'll get it, but first I need to move you somewhere warmer. This concrete is stealing your body heat. Can you help me at all, or do I need to carry you? House, Ruth said, too heavy to carry. We'll make it work, Claire said. She positioned herself behind Ruth, got her arms under the older woman's armpits and lifted. Ruth was not heavy, maybe 130 pounds, but Claire was exhausted and hypothermic herself. Lifting Ruth's dead weight was like lifting stone. She made it maybe 3 steps before her legs started to buckle. This was not going to work. She needed a different approach. She remembered the horse blankets. Quickly, working with urgency born of desperation, she arranged several blankets into a makeshift sled. Rolled Ruth onto it carefully, making sure she was centered, making sure the blankets would support her weight. Then Claire grabbed the corners and started pulling. The blankets slid across the concrete floor more easily than Claire had hoped. Not easy, but manageable. She pulled Ruth to the barn door, paused to catch her breath, then out into the storm. 50 feet to the house. Just 50 feet. She could do 50 feet. The journey across that small distance was one of the hardest things Claire had ever done. The wind tried to tear the blanket sled from her hands. The snow was thigh-deep. Her body was past exhaustion, running on nothing but will. Several times she fell, going down to her knees or her hands, and had to force herself back upright. But she kept pulling, kept moving forward, kept Ruth sliding across the snow toward the house. The back door was unlocked. Claire pulled Ruth inside into a mudroom, then through into the kitchen. The house was cold, not as cold as outside, but still well below freezing. The wood stove in the living room had gone out hours ago, but it was shelter. It was out of the wind. It was where they needed to be. Claire left Ruth on the blanket sled and ran to find aspirin. Found the bathroom, found the medicine cabinet, grabbed the bottle of aspirin and anything else that looked like it might help. Ran back to the kitchen. Gave Ruth 3 more aspirin tablets with water from the tap that was barely flowing, almost frozen. Then she had to deal with the cold, had to get heat into this house or they would both die of hypothermia before morning. The wood stove was her only option. Claire ran to it, cleaned out the dead ash, stuffed it with kindling and paper and anything that would burn. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the matches. But finally she got one lit, touched it to the kindling, watched the flame catch and spread. She fed the fire carefully, adding larger pieces as the kindling burned, building it up until real heat started radiating from the stove. Only then did she go back to Ruth. The older woman was more alert now, her eyes open and tracking Claire's movements. The nitroglycerin and aspirin were helping. The warmth starting to fill the room was helping, but Ruth was still in critical condition, still in danger, still dependent on Claire's ability to keep her alive until morning when maybe the storm would ease enough to call for help. Claire dragged Ruth closer to the stove, positioning her where the heat could reach her but not so close that sparks might catch the blankets. She checked Ruth's pulse again. Still irregular but maybe a touch stronger. Built the fire higher. Found more blankets and piled them on. Activated more hand warmers and placed them strategically. Then she went back out into the storm one more time to care for the horses. Gunner and Rusty were where she had left them, both shaking from exhaustion and cold. Claire led them into the barn one at a time, her body moving on autopilot because there was no strength left, only the knowledge that the horses had saved 2 lives tonight and deserved care. She rubbed them down as best she could with hands that barely functioned, gave them hay and water, covered them with every horse blanket she could find, told them they were good horses, brave horses, heroes. Then she stumbled back to the house and collapsed on the floor beside Ruth, too exhausted to go further. The older woman's eyes were open, watching her. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, "for coming, for risking your life." Claire managed a weak smile. "Our fathers made choices that kept them apart. I made a different choice." She pulled the photograph from her waterproof pocket, the image she had carried through the storm, showed it to Ruth. "2 families," Claire said, "before the split. That's you as a little girl, that's me as a baby. Our fathers were friends once." Ruth stared at the photograph, tears flowing freely now. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Tom never told me they were that close." "Water rights tore them apart," Claire said. 38 years of separation over something that matters less every year. I found my father's journal last night. He regretted it his whole life, but he never reached out, too proud, too stubborn. "And they both died alone," Ruth said quietly. Claire nodded. "But we don't have to. That cycle ends with us, if you want it to." Ruth reached out with a trembling hand and touched the photograph. "Our daughters should have known each other," she said. "Should have been friends." "They still can," Claire said. "Different generation, same chance." Ruth's eyes closed, exhaustion claiming her, but she was smiling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered again, "for choosing differently." Claire sat beside her through the long night, monitoring her pulse, feeding the fire, keeping watch. Outside, the storm raged on, trying to bury the world in white. Inside, 2 women who barely knew each other but were bound by their father's choices kept each other alive. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, Claire understood that she had not just saved Ruth's life tonight. She had saved her own, had chosen connection over isolation, had chosen to reach across a divide created by pride and stubbornness, had chosen to be the person Michael would have been proud of, the person her father might have become if he had found the courage to apologize. The journey through the blizzard had been 12 miles of hell, but it had also been the first step toward healing a wound that was decades old, toward building something better than what had been lost, toward proving that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is answer that call. The storm would pass, morning would come, and 2 women would face it together instead of alone. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of Claire's life. She sat on the floor beside Ruth, her back against the wall that was cold even through her coat, feeding the wood stove every 30 minutes to keep the temperature in the house above freezing. Each time she added wood, she had to move carefully, her body stiff and aching from the ordeal of the journey, muscles screaming in protest at every motion. The storm continued outside with undiminished fury, wind rattling the windows in their frames, snow piling against the walls in drifts that would take days to melt. The world reduced to this small circle of warmth and light, and 2 women who had almost let pride and history keep them strangers forever. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind, old boards settling, joints flexing, the whole structure seeming to breathe with each gust. Claire had grown up in an old house like this, understood its language, knew the difference between normal settling and dangerous stress. This house was solid, built by people who understood Montana weather, who had constructed it to survive exactly this kind of storm. It would hold. They would be safe. If Ruth's heart held out. Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting battles on multiple fronts. The cardiac damage from hours of insufficient blood flow, the shock from prolonged exposure and pain, the hypothermia from lying on a frozen barn floor. Her breathing was shallow and rapid sometimes, deep and labored other times, the rhythm irregular in ways that made Claire's stomach clench with fear. Each time Ruth's eyes closed, Claire wondered if they would open again. Each time they did open, Claire felt a wash of relief so intense it was almost painful. Claire monitored Ruth's pulse obsessively, her fingers on the older woman's wrist, feeling the flutter and skip of a heart working too hard to keep a body alive. She counted beats, timed intervals, tried to remember everything from the wilderness first aid course she had taken years ago. Normal resting heart rate was 60 to 100 beats per minute. Ruth's was fluctuating between 40 and 120, swinging wildly as her damaged heart struggled to find a rhythm it could sustain. Too slow meant not enough blood flow. Too fast meant the heart was exhausting itself. Neither was good. Every 30 minutes Claire gave Ruth water, just small sips because too much might make her nauseated. She adjusted the blankets constantly, trying to keep Ruth warm without overheating her, trying to maintain that delicate balance between hypothermia and the stress additional heat might put on her heart. She activated new chemical hand warmers as the old ones cooled, tucking them under Ruth's arms, in her groin, places where major blood vessels ran close to the surface and would carry warmth throughout her body. The fire became Claire's anchor, the one thing she could control in a situation where she was essentially helpless. She could not fix Ruth's heart, could not perform surgery or provide medications beyond the basic aspirin and nitroglycerin in her kit, could not call for help because the phone lines were still dead and her cell phone still showed no service. All she could do was keep Ruth warm and monitor her and hope it was enough. Around 1 in the morning, Ruth's eyes opened and stayed open, more alert than they had been. She looked at Claire for a long moment, taking in the younger woman's exhausted face, the frost burn on her cheeks, the way her hands still trembled from hours of exposure to cold that should have killed her. "You look terrible," Ruth said, her voice weak but carrying a hint of dry humor that suggested her mind was clearing. "You should see yourself," Claire replied, managing a tired smile. "I can imagine." Ruth's hand moved slightly, reaching toward Claire. "You saved my life. You know that, don't you? If you hadn't come, I'd be dead right now." Claire took Ruth's hand, felt how cold it still was despite the blankets and the fire. "Rusty saved both of us. She's the hero. I just followed her." "You chose to follow," Ruth said. "That's what matters. You could have stayed home, could have told yourself it wasn't your responsibility, that I was a stranger, that the storm made it impossible." "Those thoughts all went through my head," Claire admitted. "The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stay put, that riding out in a blizzard was suicide." "So why did you come?" Claire was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something she was still processing herself. "Because my father died alone," she said finally. "Because Michael died alone. Because I've been dying alone for 2 years, just in a different way. Because I found a photograph last night that showed me what could have been if our fathers had chosen differently." She pulled out the photograph again, held it where Ruth could see it in the firelight. "2 little girls who should have grown up as friends," she said. "2 families who should have supported each other through hard times. 38 years lost because of water rights and pride." Ruth stared at the photograph, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Tom never told me he and your father were that close. He just said they had a falling out over property, that some friendships don't survive business disputes. My father wrote in his journal that he regretted it every day, Claire said, that he missed his friend, but he never reached out, never tried to make it right. He chose pride over reconciliation. Tom did the same, Ruth said softly. I remember he would go quiet sometimes, get this look on his face like he was somewhere else. I'd ask what he was thinking about and he'd say old friends, old mistakes, but he never explained, never told me what he'd lost. They were both stubborn men, Claire said. Maybe that's what it takes to survive out here. That kind of determined refusal to bend. But it cost them something important. Ruth closed her eyes, fresh tears leaking out. It cost us too. Our daughters could have known each other, could have grown up together. Maybe if Sarah had friends here, if she'd felt connected to this place through more than just her parents, she wouldn't have needed to run so far away. The mention of a daughter surprised Claire. She had wondered about the little girl in the photograph, what had become of her. She realized now that Ruth's isolation was layered, complicated by grief that went beyond losing a husband. Tell me about Sarah, she said gently, settling in for what she sensed would be a painful conversation but an important one. Ruth was quiet for so long that Claire thought she might have drifted back into unconsciousness. But then she began to speak, her voice low and filled with a grief that had not diminished with time, that had perhaps intensified with the years of carrying it alone. Sarah was brilliant, Ruth said, and even now, years after her death, the pride in her voice was unmistakable. From the time she was little, she was different from other ranch kids, curious about everything, always reading, books stacked beside her bed, library trips every week where she'd check out the maximum allowed and finish them all before they were due, always asking questions that made me realize I didn't know as much as I thought I did. Why is the sky blue? What makes thunder? Where do ideas come from? Questions that had real answers I couldn't provide. Tom and I, we were simple people, Ruth continued. We understood ranching and animals and weather. We could read a storm front and knew when to move cattle and could diagnose most livestock illnesses just by looking. But Sarah wanted to understand the world. Politics and literature and ideas. Philosophy and history and the big questions about meaning and purpose. She'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework and ask questions about things we'd never even thought about. It sounds like she was special, Claire said. She was, Ruth agreed, but we didn't know what to do with her. We loved her desperately, would have done anything for her, but we couldn't understand her. It was like she spoke a language we didn't know. We kept thinking she'd grow out of it, that she'd realize ranching was a good life, that the land mattered, that legacy was worth preserving, that she'd find a local boy and settle down and take over the ranch and give us grandchildren who would grow up here the way she had. But that's not what she wanted, Claire said quietly. No, Ruth said. She felt trapped, suffocated, like the ranch was a prison keeping her from the life she was meant to have. She told me once when she was 16 that she loved me and her father, but she couldn't breathe here, that she needed more than sky and grass and cattle, needed culture and complexity and challenge. I didn't understand, took it as rejection, as her saying our life wasn't good enough for her. Claire knew that feeling intimately, had felt it herself at times, even though she loved the land, the weight of expectations pressing down, the sense that choosing differently would be betrayal of everyone who came before. She got a scholarship to NYU, Ruth continued, her voice catching slightly. Full ride, journalism program, one of the best in the country. She was accepted early decision in December of her senior year. Tom and I should have been thrilled, should have celebrated. Our daughter was brilliant enough to get a full scholarship to a top university. What parent wouldn't be proud? But you weren't, Claire said, understanding the complexity, the way love and fear and expectations could tangle together into something toxic. We were proud, Ruth said, but we were also hurt and scared. The ranch was our whole life. We'd built it for her, built it to pass down, made every decision with her future in mind. The thought of her walking away from it felt like rejection. Like everything we'd worked for, every sacrifice we'd made, didn't matter to her at all. She paused, struggling for breath, and Claire gave her more water, waited for her to settle. We had a terrible fight the night before she left for New York, Ruth said. August of 1995. I can still see her face. She was 18, so young, excited and scared and trying to be brave. Tom told her she was abandoning her heritage. Said 4 generations of Carmichaels had worked this land and she was throwing it away for some fantasy about being a writer in the city. Said she'd come crawling back when she realized the world didn't care about ranch kids with big dreams. Sarah shouted back that it was his dream, not hers. That she'd never asked to inherit a ranch. That loving someone didn't mean living their life instead of your own. That she was going to make something of herself that had nothing to do with cattle or grass or isolation. "What did you say?" Claire asked. "I tried to make peace, but I made it worse," Ruth admitted. "I told Sarah she was breaking her father's heart, that she was being selfish. That family meant sacrifice, and she needed to grow up and accept her responsibilities. I thought I was teaching her about maturity. Really, I was just trying to manipulate her into staying through guilt." The next morning she left, barely said goodbye, drove away in a borrowed car, and I watched her go and I was so angry, so hurt. I told myself she'd realize her mistake. She'd come home, but she didn't. What happened? She left for New York in August of 1995, just 18 years old. We had that terrible fight and she went anyway. At first Sarah called every week, full of stories about the city and her classes and her new life. Ruth tried to be supportive, tried to be interested, but every story felt like evidence that they were losing their daughter to a world they did not understand. The phone calls became less frequent, Ruth said, once a month. Then just holidays, then just Christmas cards with brief notes that revealed nothing of substance. Sarah married someone named David Foster. We never met him, had a daughter in 2012. Emma. We saw one photograph sent in a Christmas card, a beautiful little blonde baby, our granddaughter, and we didn't know her. Ruth's voice broke. Claire squeezed her hand, offering silent support. In 2020, Sarah called out of the blue, Ruth said. After years of minimal contact, she was getting divorced. Said things had been hard. The pandemic had cost her her job as a journalist. She was struggling. Said she needed to come home for a while. Wanted to bring Emma so we could finally meet our granddaughter. I was so happy. I thought we were getting a second chance. She was going to drive from Philadelphia. Said it would take 3 days, but she wanted Emma to see the country. What happened? She never made it, Ruth whispered. 3 days after that call, we got another call, Pennsylvania State Police. Sarah had been driving west on Interstate 80 heading home to us. Single car accident outside Pittsburgh. They said she probably fell asleep at the wheel. She'd been driving for hours trying to get to us. She died at the scene. April of 2020. Emma was in the car but survived. Minor injuries. They said Sarah probably swerved to protect her daughter. The passenger side was intact. The driver's side was destroyed. Claire felt tears on her own cheeks now. I'm so sorry. Tom and I flew to Pennsylvania for the funeral, Ruth continued. Met Emma for the first and only time. She was 8 years old. Looked so much like Sarah at that age. She sat between her paternal grandparents at the service, this little girl who just lost her mother, and she had no idea who we were. We were strangers to our own granddaughter. Did you try to stay in touch? I wanted to, Ruth said, but the Fosters were polite and distant. They made it clear they had raised Emma while Sarah was working, that the girl was settled with them, that disruption wouldn't be good for her. I understood. They were right. What could I offer her? A ranch in Montana with old people she didn't know. Tom was already sick by then. The cancer had started. He died a year later. 2021. Left me completely alone. Ruth turned her head to look at Claire directly. Now I'm 64 years old. I have a granddaughter who's 12 and doesn't know me. My daughter died thinking I disapproved of her choices. My husband died wishing he'd reconciled with your father. And I almost died tonight completely alone because I was too proud to admit I needed help. But you did ask for help, Claire pointed out. You sent Rusty. That took courage. Desperation, Ruth corrected. I was dying and terrified and desperate. That's not the same as having the courage to reach out when you're healthy and it's just loneliness that's killing you. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the storm howling outside. Claire thought about her own isolation, her own refusal to ask for help or accept it when offered. David calling from California, begging her to move, to start over. Friends in town inviting her to dinners she declined. The Ranchers Association meetings she skipped. The slow withdrawal into solitude that had seemed like strength but was really just fear. I've been doing the same thing, Claire said finally, telling myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need anyone, that accepting help or admitting loneliness was weakness. After Michael died, I pushed everyone away, stopped answering calls, stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. I convinced myself I was honoring his memory by keeping the ranch going alone, but really I was just hiding. From what? From having to live, Claire said. From having to feel anything besides grief and duty. From risking loving anyone else and losing them too. Ruth squeezed Claire's hand with what little strength she had. We're a pair, aren't we? Two stubborn women dying alone by choice and calling it strength. The cycle ends with us, Claire said firmly. That's what I told you earlier and I meant it. Our fathers let pride destroy their friendship. We're not making that mistake. But I'm 64, Ruth said. You're 37. What kind of friendship could we have? You're young enough to be my daughter. Sarah would have been about my age if she'd lived, Claire pointed out. Maybe this is what was supposed to happen. Maybe we were meant to find each other, even if it took a blizzard and a heart attack to make it happen. Ruth managed a weak smile. The universe has a dark sense of humor. Around 3 in the morning, Ruth's condition deteriorated sharply. Her breathing became labored, each breath requiring visible effort, her chest rising and falling irregularly. Her pulse weakened under Claire's fingers, the beats becoming thready and difficult to count, sometimes seeming to disappear entirely before returning. Her skin took on a gray pallor that Claire recognized from when her father died, the color of a body shutting down, prioritizing core organs over peripheral circulation. Claire's own heart rate spiked with fear. This was it. The moment when Ruth's damaged heart finally gave out. The moment when all the struggle and courage of the night before would be for nothing. She administered another nitroglycerin tablet with shaking hands, placing it under Ruth's tongue, hoping there was enough cardiac function left for the medication to help. Gave her more aspirin crushed and dissolved in water because Ruth was too weak to swallow pills. Elevated her upper body slightly with pillows, trying to reduce the work the heart had to do, trying to make breathing easier. Stay with me, Claire said urgently, gripping Ruth's hand, willing her own life force into the older woman if that were somehow possible. Come on, Ruth. You survived this long. You sent Rusty through a blizzard. You held on for 8 hours before I got here. You made it through the night. Don't give up now. Don't you dare give up now. But Ruth's eyes were closing, her consciousness slipping away. Her breathing became more shallow, more irregular. Claire could see her chest movements becoming weaker, the intervals between breaths lengthening. Claire did the only thing she could think of. She started talking, forcing Ruth to engage, to focus on something besides dying. Talk to me, Claire demanded. Come on, tell me more about Emma. What does she look like now? What do you know about her? Stay awake and tell me about your granddaughter. The tactic worked barely. Ruth's eyes fluttered open, struggled to focus. Blonde, she managed, her voice so weak Claire had to lean close to hear, like Sarah. The Fosters send a photo with their Christmas card every year. Last year's photo showed her at a soccer game, wearing a jersey, number 7. She's tall for her age, athletic, looks strong and healthy and happy. What else? Claire pressed. What else do you know? Straight a student, Ruth whispered. The Fosters mentioned it in their Christmas letter, says she wants to be a teacher, loves reading like Sarah did, has a dog named Scout, lives in a house with a backyard, goes to a good school. Each detail seemed to cost Ruth tremendous effort, but speaking also seemed to anchor her, to give her something to hold onto besides the pain and fear. Claire kept her talking, kept her engaged, for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Slowly, gradually, Ruth's condition stabilized again. Her pulse strengthened slightly. Her breathing evened out. The crisis passed, or at least retreated. Claire sagged against the wall in relief, her own body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. That was close, Ruth whispered. Too close, Claire agreed. Don't do that again, you scared me. Scared myself, Ruth admitted. Thought I was done, thought this was it. But it wasn't, Claire said firmly. You're still here, still fighting. Your heart is stubborn like the rest of you. Ruth managed a weak smile. Runs in the family, apparently. Do you write to her? Claire asked after Ruth seemed more stable. To Emma. Birthday cards, Ruth said. Just a simple message. Happy birthday, love Grandma Ruth. Sometimes I write more, but then I cross it out. What right do I have to her attention? I'm a stranger who sends cards once a year. You're her grandmother, Claire said. Her only connection to her mother's side of the family. That's not nothing. Ruth's eyes drifted closed. I wrote her a letter, she said quietly, couple weeks ago. A real letter telling her about Sarah, asking if she wanted to visit. It's in my desk. Never sent it, too afraid. Claire felt something shift in her chest. Where in your desk? Top drawer, in an envelope, already addressed and stamped. Just needed the courage to mail it. After Ruth drifted into an uneasy sleep, Claire went to find the desk. She knew she was invading privacy, but something told her this was important. The desk was in a small office off the kitchen, neat and organized, everything in its place. She opened the top drawer and found the envelope immediately. It was addressed to Emma Carmichael Foster in Philadelphia, stamped and ready to mail. Claire held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the hope and fear it represented. Then she carefully opened it and read. The letter was in Ruth's handwriting, shakier than the journal entries Claire had read from her father, but still legible. It was dated 2 weeks ago. Dear Emma, you don't know me except as the woman who sends birthday cards. I'm your grandmother Ruth, your mother Sarah's mother. I've wanted to reach out properly for years, but I didn't know how. I was afraid you'd think I was a stranger trying to insert myself into your life, which I suppose I am, in a way. I'm writing now because I'm 64, and I've realized I can't wait anymore. Time moves faster than we think it will, and opportunities slip away while we're being afraid. Your mother was the most brilliant, beautiful person I ever knew. She wanted to see the world, and I wanted her to stay on a ranch in Montana. We both loved each other, but we couldn't understand each other. I regret every day that I didn't tell her this. Your dreams matter more than mine. I love you no matter where you live or what you choose to do with your life. She was coming to see me when she died. Did you know that? She was bringing you to meet me. After years of distance, we were going to have a second chance. I think she'd forgiven me for being a stubborn old woman. I never got to tell her I was sorry for not understanding sooner. I have a ranch in Montana. It's beautiful here in a way that's hard to explain. Big sky country, they call it, and it's true. The sky goes on forever, and the land teaches you things about yourself if you're willing to listen. Your mother grew up here. She learned to ride before she could walk. She loved the horses even if she didn't love the ranching life. This ranch will be yours someday if you want it. I put it in my will. But more than that, I want you to know that you have a grandmother who loves you, who thinks about you every day, who wants to know you if you're interested. I understand if you're not. I understand if this letter feels too late or too presumptuous, but I had to try, had to reach out while I still could. If you want to write back or visit or just talk on the phone, I would like that very much. If you'd rather not, I understand that too. Either way, I want you to know that your mother loved you, and I love you, and you come from people who are stubborn and difficult but who love deeply when they finally figure out how. With love, Grandma Ruth. Claire read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. This was what she had found last night in her father's journal: regret, love, the desperate wish to make things right before it was too late, the fear that held people back from reaching out even when reaching out was the only thing that mattered. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Ruth had written this 2 weeks ago and never sent it, had carried it around, probably reading it and rereading it, debating whether to mail it, afraid of rejection, afraid of hope. Claire went back to Ruth's side and watched her sleep, monitored her breathing and pulse, kept the fire going, and made a decision. When this was over, when Ruth was stable, Claire would make sure this letter got to Emma, would make sure the girl knew her grandmother wanted to know her, would do what she could to bridge another gap created by fear and stubbornness. Dawn came slowly, the darkness outside shifting to gray by increments so small they were almost unnoticeable. The storm had begun to ease sometime during the night. The wind was still strong but no longer howling with demonic fury. The snow was still falling, but not with the blinding intensity that made visibility impossible. Claire stood at the window and watched the world emerge from darkness. The landscape was transformed, buried under snow that made everything alien and new. Drifts piled 6 feet high against the buildings. The road was completely impassable, just a vague depression under uniform white. But the sun was rising and the storm was passing, and they had survived the night. She checked her phone, still no service, tried the landline, still dead. They were still isolated, still cut off, but Ruth had made it through the night. Her pulse was stronger, her breathing more regular. The nitroglycerin and aspirin had bought them time. Around 8 in the morning, Ruth woke fully, more alert than she had been since Claire arrived. Her color was better. Her eyes were clear. She looked at Claire and managed a real smile. "We made it," she said. "We did," Claire confirmed. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by my entire herd," Ruth said, "but alive, thanks to you." "Thanks to Rusty," Claire corrected again. "She's the one who ran through a blizzard to find help." "How is she?" Ruth asked immediately, concerned for her horse overriding everything else. "And Gunnar, are they okay?" "They're in the barn, fed and watered and resting. They're exhausted, but they'll be fine." Ruth closed her eyes in relief. "Thank God. I couldn't bear it if she'd been hurt because of me." "She wasn't," Claire assured her. "She's a hero. They both are." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire warm, the storm easing outside. Two women who had survived something impossible together. Then Ruth spoke quietly. "The letter in my desk. Did you find it?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have read it without permission. But I needed to know what you'd written." "I'm glad you did," Ruth said, "because I'm going to ask you to mail it for me. I'm too much of a coward to do it myself. But if you mail it, then it's out of my hands. Emma will get it or she won't. She'll respond or she won't. But at least I'll have tried." "I'll mail it," Claire promised, "the minute I get back to town. But I think you should send something more too. A photo of the ranch, of the horses, of you. Give Emma something concrete to connect to. If I survive this, Ruth said. You'll survive, Claire said firmly. I didn't ride through that storm to lose you now. Around 9:30, Claire checked her phone again and nearly wept when she saw one bar of service. Just one, flickering and unreliable but present. She dialed 911 with shaking hands, praying the call would go through. It did, a dispatcher answered. Claire explained the situation as clearly as she could. Ruth Carmichael, age 64, heart attack approximately 19 hours ago. Stable but needs immediate medical attention. Location, the Carmichael Ranch on Timber Ridge Road, 12 miles north of the Whitmore Ranch. The dispatcher told her it would be several hours. They had multiple emergencies across the county from the storm. Roads were impassable, but they would send a helicopter as soon as conditions permitted. Could be 2 hours, could be 4. Stay with the patient. Keep her warm and stable. Claire relayed this to Ruth, who just nodded. She had survived 19 hours. She could survive a few more. The waiting was agonizing. Claire monitored Ruth constantly, terrified that after everything, the woman would die in these last hours before help arrived. She fed the fire obsessively, gave Ruth water and aspirin at regular intervals, checked her pulse every 10 minutes. They talked to pass the time, to keep Ruth alert, to distract from the fear that help might not come in time. What will you do after this? Ruth asked at one point. Go back to your ranch and your isolation. No, Claire said. I think those days are over. I've been dying alone for 2 years. Last night reminded me what it feels like to be alive, to be connected to someone. I'm not going back to that half-life. What then? I don't know yet, Claire admitted. But I know it involves other people. Real connections, not just surface interactions. Maybe I'll start going to those ranchers' meetings again. Maybe I'll call David and actually talk to him instead of just going through the motions. Maybe I'll let myself grieve Michael properly instead of trying to freeze the grief by avoiding everything that reminds me of him. That sounds healthy, Ruth said. Painful but healthy. What about you? Claire asked. When you're recovered, what then? If I survive surgery, Ruth said, I'm going to reach out to Emma. Really reach out. Not just send cards, but call the Fosters and ask if she can visit. Ask if I can tell her about her mother. Build something real instead of just hoping from a distance. You will survive, Claire said, and Emma will visit. I feel certain about that. How can you be certain? Because you sent that letter, Claire said. You asked for help when you needed it. That's the hardest part. Everything else follows from that. The helicopter arrived at 11:43 in the morning, descending through clearing skies to land in the pasture behind Ruth's house. Claire heard it coming, the distinctive thump of rotors, and felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. She ran outside to meet the paramedics, 2 of them who jumped out with practiced efficiency and followed her to the house. They were professionals, brisk and focused, taking Ruth's vitals, starting an IV, asking questions Claire answered as best she could. One of them, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, turned to Claire after her initial assessment. You saved her life. The aspirin and nitroglycerin bought her critical time. Keeping her warm prevented shock from killing her. Another hour, maybe 2, and we'd be looking at a very different outcome. You did everything right. I just kept her alive, Claire said. You're the ones who can actually fix her. Sometimes keeping someone alive is the hardest part, the paramedic said. They loaded Ruth onto a stretcher, working quickly but carefully. Ruth grabbed Claire's hand before they lifted her. The horses, Ruth said, her voice urgent despite her weakness. Please take care of them until I get back. Don't let anyone take Rusty away. I promise, Claire said, she'll have the best care, all of them will. I'll move them to my ranch if that's easier. I'll treat them like heroes because that's what they are. Thank you, Ruth whispered, for everything, for coming, for staying, for being who you are. Thank you for asking for help, Claire said, for giving me a chance to be better than I've been. The paramedics lifted the stretcher, carried Ruth out to the helicopter. Claire followed, watched them load her into the aircraft, watched the doors close. The helicopter lifted off, snow swirling in the rotor wash, and Claire stood in the cold watching it disappear toward the hospital 60 miles south. She was alone again, but not isolated, not the same kind of alone she had been before. She had Ruth's letter to Emma in her pocket. She had a promise to keep about horses. She had a friendship to build with a woman who understood loss and loneliness and the courage it took to reach out. Claire went to the barn to check on Rusty and Gunner one more time. Both horses looked up when she entered, tired but alert. She spent time with each of them, brushing them, talking to them, thanking them for their courage and strength. You saved 2 lives last night, she told Rusty. Your person and me. You're a good horse, the best horse. Ruth is going to make it because of you. The mare pushed her nose against Claire's chest, accepting the praise, accepting the affection. And Claire understood that the bond between horse and human was part of what made life bearable out here, that the animals we cared for us in return, that nothing survived alone in this landscape. Everything depended on connection. She still had to get herself and 2 horses back to the Whitmore ranch, the 12-mile journey that had taken 5 hours in the storm, but the storm had passed. The sun was out. The world was visible again. It would take time, but it was possible now. Claire saddled Gunner, led Rusty out of the barn. The 2 horses seemed to understand that their work was not quite done. They moved willingly, following Claire as she started the long journey home. The trip took nearly 4 hours in the deep snow, but the horses were rested and the weather was clear. Claire navigated by landmarks that were visible now, by the fence lines and ridges and draws that made up the geography of this place. She stopped at the line shack to warm up, to give the horses a rest, to add another entry to the guest book. Made it to Ruth Carmichael. She's alive and on her way to the hospital, returning home now. Thank you again to everyone who maintained this shelter. It saved 3 lives this time. 2 human, 1 horse. We'll continue the tradition. Claire Whitmore. When she finally saw the Whitmore ranch ahead, the familiar buildings that meant home, Claire felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Gratitude. Not just for survival, though that was part of it, but gratitude for life, for connection, for the chance to be part of something larger than her own grief and isolation. She had ridden into the storm alone. She was coming home changed, not fixed, not healed, but no longer determined to die slowly in solitude, ready instead to live, to reach out, to build something better than what had been lost. The horses were exhausted. Claire cared for them with gentle hands, gave them the best hay and grain, covered them with warm blankets, told them they were heroes and would always be remembered. Then she went into her house and collapsed on the couch, too tired to make it to bed. She slept for 16 hours straight, and when she woke, the first thing she did was call the hospital to check on Ruth. The woman was stable, surgery scheduled for the next day, prognosis cautiously optimistic. Claire left a message to be delivered to Ruth when she was conscious. Tell her Claire promises to take care of the horses. Tell her Emma's letter will be mailed today. Tell her we're going to build something better than what our fathers lost. Tell her she's not alone anymore. Then Claire went to the kitchen table where the photograph still sat. 2 families before the split. She picked it up, held it to the light, studied the faces of people long dead and children now grown. The cycle ends with us, she said out loud. It ends with us. Ruth Carmichael underwent triple bypass surgery on a gray December morning, while Claire sat in the hospital waiting room drinking terrible coffee and trying not to think about all the ways the operation could go wrong. The surgery took 8 hours. 8 hours of Claire pacing and sitting and pacing again, of checking her phone for messages that did not come, of watching other families receive news good and bad while she waited alone. She had arrived at 4 in the morning to see Ruth before they took her to surgery. Ruth had been awake, groggy from pre-operative medications, but alert enough to grip Claire's hand with surprising strength. "If I don't make it," Ruth had said, her voice slurred slightly, "tell Emma I love her, that I died thinking about her, that the ranch is hers." "You're going to make it," Claire had said firmly, "and you're going to tell her yourself, many times for many years." "But if I don't," Ruth insisted, "promise me you'll look after her, make sure she knows about Sarah, about the ranch, about where she comes from." "I promise," Claire said, "but I won't need to, because you're going to be fine." They had wheeled Ruth away at 4:30. Claire had watched her disappear through double doors marked surgery, authorized personnel only, and then there was nothing to do but wait. The waiting room was institutional and depressing. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights that hummed, a television in the corner playing morning news that no one watched, other families clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, all of them bound by the terrible uncertainty of waiting to hear if someone they loved would survive. Claire tried to read but could not focus, tried to work on ranch paperwork but the numbers blurred. Mostly she just sat and remembered. The storm, the journey, finding Ruth barely alive, the long night of keeping her breathing. All of it would mean nothing if Ruth died on an operating table after surviving everything else. Around noon, a different family received bad news. Claire watched the surgeon deliver it, saw the moment when hope turned to grief, heard the mother's wail of anguish. The family collapsed into each other, their pain too private for a public waiting room but with nowhere else to go. Claire looked away, giving them what privacy she could, but her own fear intensified. That could be her in a few hours. That could be the news she received. The surgeon finally emerged at 4 in the afternoon, still wearing scrubs, his surgical cap pulled down, his face showing the exhaustion of 8 hours of intense concentration. Claire stood up so fast she felt dizzy, her heart hammering. "Ms. Whitmore," the surgeon said, checking his clipboard. "Yes," Claire managed. "How is she?" "The operation went well," he said, and Claire felt her knees go weak with relief. "Better than expected, actually. We bypassed 3 severely blocked arteries. The right coronary artery was 95% occluded. The left anterior descending was 80% blocked. The circumflex was 90%. Any one of those could have killed her. All 3 together, it's remarkable she survived the initial event at all." "But she's okay now?" Claire asked. "She's stable," he said. "The heart is pumping well, blood flow is restored. The damage from the prolonged cardiac event is significant. We lost some heart muscle. That's permanent. But with the bypasses in place, the remaining healthy tissue should compensate. With proper recovery and rehabilitation, cardiac rehab, lifestyle modifications, she should make a good recovery. Not back to ranching full-time, but a functional, productive life." "Can I see her?" "She's in recovery now, heavily sedated, but you can sit with her if you'd like. Just don't expect her to wake up or talk for several hours yet. She's been through major trauma. Her body needs rest." Claire sat beside Ruth's hospital bed and watched machines beep and hiss, tracking heart rate and blood pressure and oxygen saturation. Ruth looked small in the hospital bed, diminished somehow, tubes and wires connecting her to technology that was keeping her alive. But her chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. Color was slowly returning to her face. The gray pallor of cardiac failure was fading. Claire stayed until visiting hours ended at 8 p.m. then drove the 60 miles back to her ranch through darkness and snow-packed roads that were treacherous in places where ice had formed. The storm had passed days ago, but the evidence of it remained everywhere. Drifts piled against buildings that would not melt until spring. Trees bent and broken under the weight of accumulated snow. Some snapped completely, their broken trunks jutting up like bones. Roads narrowed to single lanes, by plowed berms on either side that were taller than Claire's truck. She made it home safely, fed the horses, checked on Ruth's horses that were now integrated into her barn, and collapsed on the couch without eating dinner. Exhaustion pulled her under into dreamless sleep. The next morning, Claire drove into town with 2 envelopes in her coat pocket. One was addressed to Emma Carmichael Foster in Philadelphia. The other was addressed to her brother David in California. She mailed both at the post office, watching the clerk stamp them and toss them into the outgoing bin, feeling like she was releasing something important into the world with no way to control what happened next. Ruth's letter to Emma said everything that needed saying about love and regret and second chances. Claire's letter to David was shorter but no less important. David, she had written, "You were right about me dying alone out here. I've been doing exactly that for 2 years, killing myself slowly with isolation and calling it strength. But something happened during the blizzard that changed me. I can't explain it all in a letter. Call me when you get this. I want to actually talk to you, really talk, not just go through the motions. I miss my brother. Love, Claire." The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Claire drove to the hospital every afternoon, sat with Ruth for the 2 hours visiting time allowed, helped with the small things that nurses did not have time for, reading aloud from books Ruth enjoyed, helping her eat when her hands were too weak to manage utensils, just being present so Ruth did not have to face recovery alone. They talked during those visits, conversations that grew deeper as Ruth's strength returned, about the ranch and the horses and the practical matters of running operations alone, about loneliness and grief and the ways people survived or did not survive loss, about their fathers and the friendship destroyed by pride, about Sarah and Michael and Tom and all the people they had loved who were gone. On the 4th day, Ruth asked about Rusty and the other horses. Claire pulled out her phone and showed photographs. Rusty looking healthy and content in Claire's barn, standing next to Gunner as if they had always been stablemates. The other horses from Ruth's small herd integrated into Claire's operation, all of them receiving the best care Claire could provide. "She looks happy," Ruth said, studying the photograph of Rusty. "I worried she'd be traumatized, what she went through in that storm." "I think she knows she's a hero," Claire said. "She carries herself differently now, proud, like she understands what she accomplished." Ruth smiled, the expression still weak but genuine. "She saved 2 lives that night, mine and yours. That's worth being proud of." 3 lives, Claire corrected. "I would have died in that storm without her leading me through it. We both owe her everything." On the 10th day, Ruth received a letter. The nurse brought it with lunch, a cream-colored envelope with careful handwriting and a Philadelphia postmark. Ruth stared at it for a long moment, not touching it, her face going pale. "It's from Emma," she whispered. "The return address. It's from Emma." Claire stood up, gave Ruth privacy. "I'll step out." "No," Ruth said quickly. "Please stay. I don't think I can do this alone." Claire sat back down and watched Ruth open the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written on lined notebook paper, the handwriting round and careful, clearly from someone young. Ruth read it silently first, tears streaming down her face. Then she read it aloud, her voice breaking on nearly every word. "Dear Grandma Ruth, I got your letter and I've read it about 10 times. The Fosters showed it to me the day it arrived and said I could decide if I wanted to respond. I've been thinking about it all week. I'm sorry you never got to meet my mom again before she died. The Fosters told me she was on her way to see you when the accident happened. I didn't know that before. I always thought she was just driving for work or something. Knowing she was trying to bring me to meet you makes me feel better and sadder at the same time. I don't remember my mom very well. I was only 8 when she died, but I remember she used to tell me stories about growing up on a ranch in Montana, about learning to ride horses and helping with cattle and the sky being so big you could see forever. She made it sound beautiful even though she said she had to leave to become who she needed to be. I would like to visit the ranch sometime. Maybe this summer if that's okay. My foster grandparents, the Fosters, said they would help arrange it. They're good people. They took care of me when Mom died and they've been like real grandparents. But they also think it's important for me to know my mom's family. I play soccer and I like reading and I want to be a teacher when I grow up. I'm in 7th grade. I have a dog named Scout who is the best dog in the world. I'm sending a picture of me from this year's school photo. I'm the tall one. I don't know if we'll be close or what it will be like, but I'd like to try if you would. Mom would want that, I think. Love, Emma. P.S. I'm sorry you had a heart attack. Mrs. Foster said that's what the lady who mailed your letter told them on the phone. I hope you're okay now. I want to meet you. Ruth sobbed, the kind of crying that came from some deep place where grief and joy mixed together. Claire moved to her bedside, held her hand, let her cry. She wants to meet me, Ruth said between sobs. She wants to visit after everything. After I failed Sarah so badly, Emma still wants to know me. Of course she does, Claire said gently. You're her grandmother. Her only connection to her mother, that matters. What if I disappoint her? What if she comes and realizes I'm just a difficult old woman who doesn't know how to talk to children? Then you'll learn, Claire said. You'll figure it out together. That's what family does. Ruth clutched the letter like it was something precious and fragile. This is because of you. If you hadn't mailed it, if you hadn't cared enough. I mailed it because you had the courage to write it, Claire said. You did the hard part. I just put a stamp on it. 2 weeks after the surgery, Ruth was moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility where she would spend the next month regaining strength and learning to manage her new cardiac limitations. The facility was nice enough, clean and well-staffed, but being there meant being away from the ranch, away from the horses, away from everything familiar. Claire visited 3 times a week, bringing updates from both ranches, photographs of the animals, small comforts from home. During one visit, Ruth raised something that had clearly been on her mind. Claire, she said carefully, I've been thinking about the future, about both our ranches and what happens next. Claire settled into the visitor's chair, sensing this was important. I can't run my operation alone anymore, Ruth continued. The doctors made that clear. I need to reduce stress, probably need to reduce the herd size, maybe even consider selling, moving to town like everyone's been telling me to do for years. Is that what you want? Claire asked. No, Ruth said immediately, but I don't see another option. I'm 64 years old with a heart that nearly killed me. I can't do the physical work anymore. Can't take the risk. Claire had been thinking about this too, had been turning over possibilities in her mind during the long drives to and from the hospital. What if you didn't have to do it alone? She said. Ruth looked at her questioningly. What if we combined operations? Claire continued, leaning forward. Your ranch and mine, partners, we'd manage both properties jointly. Share resources, share labor, share decision-making. Your 800 acres plus my 3,000. Your 30 cattle plus my 93. Your 4 horses plus my 19. Combined, we'd be big enough to hire help, to divide the physical work, to actually have sustainable operations. instead of two people slowly killing themselves, trying to do everything alone. Ruth was quiet, clearly processing. That's generous, but it's not equal. You'd be doing most of the work, taking most of the risk. You bring experience I don't have, Claire said. Wisdom, a different perspective, and you bring land and water rights and livestock. Most importantly, you bring someone who understands this life. Someone I can actually talk to about the things that matter. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. You're offering me a way to keep my ranch, to not have to give up everything Tom and I built. I'm offering partnership, Claire said. Real partnership, not charity. I need this as much as you do. I've been dying of loneliness for 2 years. You've been dying of it for 3. Maybe together we can actually live. They spent the next hour working through details. How the partnership would function. How they would divide responsibilities. What would happen if one of them died or became incapacitated. Ruth insisted on legal structure that protected Claire's larger investment. Claire insisted on provisions that gave Ruth equal say in all decisions. When we're both gone, Ruth said at one point, the land goes to Emma and David. They can decide what to do with it, sell it or keep it or develop it, whatever they want, but at least they'll have options. And they'll have the story, Claire added, of how 2 women chose differently than their fathers, how they built something better from something broken. David called 3 days after Claire's letter should have arrived. His voice over the phone was tentative, uncertain, like he was not sure what kind of reception he would get. Claire, he said, I got your letter. Are you okay? What happened? Claire told him everything, the photograph and the journal, the blizzard and Rusty's desperate journey, the 12 miles through hell, finding Ruth, the long night, the surgery and recovery. David listened without interrupting, and when Claire finished, he was quiet for a long time. Jesus, Claire, he finally said, you could have died. That was the most insane, reckless, stupid thing I've ever heard, and also the bravest. I don't know whether to yell at you or nominate you for sainthood. Don't do either, Claire said, smiling despite herself. Just come visit. I want you to meet Ruth. I want you to see what I'm building here. It's different than what Dad had. Better, I think. Better how? It's not about suffering alone and calling it strength anymore, Claire said. It's about connection, community, choosing to let people in instead of shutting them out. David promised to visit in the spring when the weather improved and he could get time off work. They talked for over an hour, really talked, the way they had not talked in years, about Michael and their father and grief and healing, about Ruth and Emma and second chances, about ranching in California and whether happiness required leaving or staying or something in between. I'm proud of you, David said before they hung up, for saving that woman, for choosing to go into that storm, for figuring out how to live again. Dad would be proud too. I hope so, Claire said. I think maybe I'm finally doing what he wanted but couldn't do himself, valuing people over property, connection over pride. Ruth came home to the Carmichael ranch on a cold February afternoon, but she was not alone. Claire had spent the previous week preparing the house, stocking it with food and supplies, making sure everything was ready. She had also made it clear that Ruth would not be staying here alone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You're recovering at my place for the next month, Claire had said when they discussed the discharge plan. Non-negotiable. You need daily monitoring. Someone to make sure you're taking medications. Someone to help if you have complications. That's me. Ruth had protested, but not very hard. The truth was she was scared to be alone, scared her heart would fail again, scared she would not have the strength to call for help, scared of dying alone in the house she and Tom had shared. So Ruth moved into the Whitmore ranch guest bedroom, the room that had been Claire's mother's sewing room before cancer took her, that had sat unused for 20 years. Claire set it up carefully. Comfortable bed, reading lamp, photographs from Ruth's house so it would feel more personal, a bell Ruth could ring if she needed help in the night. The first week was an adjustment. Two women who had spent years living alone now sharing space, learning each other's rhythms and quirks. Ruth woke at 5 a.m. out of habit even though she had no livestock to feed. Claire tried to be quiet, but the old house creaked and gave away her movements. They negotiated kitchen space and bathroom schedules, and the small territories that mattered when privacy was limited. But they also discovered the comfort of company, of making coffee for two instead of one, of having someone to talk to over breakfast about the weather or the horses or nothing in particular, of not spending entire days speaking only to animals. Claire handled the physical work on both ranches while Ruth recovered, feeding all the animals, checking fence lines, managing the combined herd. It was more work than Claire had ever done alone, but somehow it felt easier because it had purpose beyond just survival. She was maintaining not just her legacy but their shared future. In the evenings they sat by the fire and planned the formal partnership, what to call it, how to structure it legally, when to tell the community. Ruth wanted to call it the Carmichael Whitmore Ranch, putting Claire's family name second because her property was larger. Claire wanted to call it the Whitmore Carmichael Ranch, alphabetically. They compromised on the Whitmore Carmichael partnership, acknowledging it was a collaboration rather than one entity absorbing the other. They hired a lawyer who specialized in agricultural operations, a woman from town who had helped dozens of ranchers navigate succession and partnership questions. She drew up documents that spelled out everything clearly: ownership percentages based on land and asset contribution, decision-making protocols, what happened if one partner wanted out or died or became incapacitated, provisions for heirs. The agreement gave Ruth security but also gave Claire protection. It was fair and professional, and exactly what they both needed. They signed it on a March morning with the lawyer as witness, their signatures making official what had already become true in practice. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in Montana. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing dead grass and mud and the bones of the landscape that had been hidden all winter. The days grew longer. The temperature climbed above freezing more days than not. Life began to return to the land. David visited in late April, flying into the regional airport and renting a car for the drive out to the ranch. Claire had not seen her brother in 2 years and was startled by how much gray had appeared in his hair, how the lines around his eyes had deepened. He was 45 now, middle-aged. They both were getting older, time moving faster than either of them was comfortable acknowledging. David met Ruth and they sized each other up like two dogs circling, each protective of Claire in their own way. But Ruth's natural warmth and David's genuine curiosity broke the ice. Within an hour they were talking easily, Ruth telling stories about Tom and the early days of their ranch, David sharing tales of California and the tech industry and life in a city of millions. Over dinner that first night, David asked the question Claire had known was coming. "So you're really doing this? The partnership thing, combining the ranches?" "We already did it," Claire said. "It's official, legal, done." "And you're happy?" Claire considered the question. Happy was complicated. She still missed Michael every day, still felt the weight of her father's death, still had moments of crushing loneliness even with Ruth in the house, but something fundamental had shifted. "I'm alive again," she said finally. "For the first time in 2 years, I'm actually living instead of just going through the motions. So yes, I'm happy, or at least I'm on my way there." David stayed for 3 days, helping with ranch work, meeting the horses, riding fence lines with Claire the way they had as children. On his last morning, they stood together at the fence line that separated what had been the Whitmore Ranch from what had been the Carmichael Ranch, looking at land that was now shared between them. "You know what's funny?" David said. "Dad spent his whole life protecting this property line, fighting to keep every acre, making sure the boundaries were clear, and you just erased it, merged everything together." "Not erased," Claire said, "transformed. Dad protected what he thought mattered. I'm protecting what actually matters: people, connection, the things that make the land worth having." David put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "I was wrong about you needing to leave. You needed to stay, just not alone, not isolated. This partnership, what you and Ruth are building, it's better than what Dad had. Better than what I have in California, if I'm being honest." "You have a life you love," Claire said. "I have a job I'm good at," David corrected. "That's not the same thing. Watching you and Ruth work together, the way you support each other, the community you're building here, that's living. I've been surviving. There's a difference." Summer came fast and hot. The grass greened and grew tall. The cattle fattened on good grazing. The horses shed their winter coats and gleamed in the sun. Ruth grew stronger every day, her cardiac function improving, her energy returning. The doctors cleared her for light work, and she threw herself into it with joy, happy to be doing something useful again. In early July, Emma arrived for her promised visit. The Fosters drove her from Philadelphia, a 3-day journey across half the country, and dropped her off at the ranch for 2 weeks. Emma was tall for 12, nearly as tall as Ruth, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and Sarah's bright, curious eyes. She was shy at first, polite and formal, calling Ruth Mrs. Carmichael until Ruth insisted on Grandma. Claire gave them space, understanding this relationship needed room to develop. But she was there at meals, at evening chores, helping facilitate without dominating. She watched Ruth teach Emma about horses, saw the girl's face light up when Rusty nuzzled her hand, heard her laugh when the mare nickered for treats. Emma asked questions constantly, the same curious mind her mother had possessed, about the ranch and the land and how everything worked, about Sarah and what she was like as a child, about Montana and its history and why anyone would choose to live somewhere so isolated. Ruth answered every question with patience and honesty, not hiding the hard parts, not pretending the estrangement with Sarah had not been painful. They sat on the porch in the evenings and Ruth told stories, painting pictures of a life Emma had never known, a mother Emma barely remembered. On Emma's 5th night, she asked to see where her mother had grown up. Ruth drove her to the Carmichael Ranch house, showed her Sarah's childhood bedroom that Ruth had kept unchanged for 17 years after Sarah left. The books Sarah had loved still on the shelves. The rodeo ribbons she had won still on the walls. The small artifacts of a life that had started here and moved on. Emma cried, standing in that room, finally understanding in some visceral way that her mother had been real, had been young, had lived here before the adult life Emma remembered. Ruth held her and cried too, both of them grieving the same person in different ways. Before Emma left at the end of 2 weeks, she asked if she could come back next summer, and maybe Christmas break too. The Fosters had already agreed. They could see the connection being built, understood its importance. "I'd like that very much," Ruth said. "This is your place too, your heritage. Come as often as you want." After Emma left, after the Fosters drove away with promises to return, Ruth sat on the porch and looked out at the land she had nearly lost. Claire sat beside her, both of them quiet. "Thank you," Ruth said finally, "for mailing that letter, for giving me this." "You earned it," Claire said. "You wrote the letter. You found the courage to reach out. I just helped get it where it needed to go." In August, Rusty gave birth. Claire had bred her to Gunner in the spring, a planned mating between 2 horses who had saved their humans, who had shown more courage than most people managed in a lifetime. The pregnancy had progressed normally, and now the foal arrived on a warm summer night with both Claire and Ruth attending the birth. The colt was perfect, chestnut like his mother with hints of buckskin in his mane and tail from his father. Strong and healthy, up and nursing within an hour, steady on his legs within two. They named him Storm, honoring the blizzard that had brought their humans together, acknowledging that from the worst circumstances could come something beautiful and strong. Emma was there when they registered the colt, helping fill out the paperwork, suggesting they include both ranch names in his registered name. They called him Storm of the Whitmore Carmichael partnership, a living symbol of what had been built from broken things. The months passed in the rhythm of ranch work and growing connection. They hired 2 ranch hands in September, young men from town who were good with animals and happy for steady work. The additional help meant neither Claire nor Ruth had to kill themselves with labor anymore. They could focus on management, on breeding decisions, on the business side of ranching rather than just the survival side. They started going to the monthly Ranchers Association meetings together, presenting their partnership as a model for how small operations could combine to remain viable. Other ranchers listened, some skeptical, some interested. Within 6 months, 2 other partnerships had formed in the county, neighbors who had been slowly failing alone choosing to combine resources and succeed together. November arrived, bringing with it the 1-year anniversary of the storm. Claire woke on that morning to find fresh snow falling, gentle and beautiful rather than violent. She stood at her window and remembered another November morning, remembered making the choice to ride into chaos, remembered everything that choice had cost and given her. Ruth appeared in the kitchen as Claire was making coffee, both of them keeping ranch hours even though they had help now. They did not mention the anniversary explicitly, but both knew what day it was, what it represented. "Should we visit the line shack?" Ruth suggested. "Add another entry to the guest book." They rode out together on a clear, cold morning, Gunner and Rusty carrying them over land that looked completely different under gentle snow instead of blizzard conditions. The line shack stood as it had for decades, weathered but solid, maintained by a community that understood the value of refuge. Inside, they added their entry to the guest book, taking turns writing. November, 1 year after the storm. Claire Whitmore and Ruth Carmichael returning to give thanks. "This shelter saved 3 lives that night. Now we maintain it for whoever needs it next. The tradition continues." The Whitmore Carmichael partnership. They left extra supplies, firewood and canned food and matches, made sure everything was ready for the next person who needed refuge, whoever they might be. For the anniversary proper, they hosted a gathering at the Whitmore Ranch. Not large, just 30 people, but it felt like the whole community in this sparsely populated corner of Montana. Neighbors and friends and the Ranchers Association members who had watched this partnership form and succeed. David flew in from California, taking time off work because his sister asked, and because he understood now that some things mattered more than career. The Fosters brought Emma from Philadelphia, the girl insisting she wanted to be there for this anniversary, wanted to be part of the story. The ranch hands brought their families, young children running around the property with the kind of freedom only ranch country allowed. The community that had supported them both through hard times came together to celebrate survival and connection, and the stubbornness that kept people rooted to this demanding land. Claire stood on her porch watching people arrive, watching trucks pull up the long driveway kicking up dust that hung in the cold air, watching strangers who had become friends gather around shared food and stories. Charlie from the feed store was there, the man who had warned Claire about Ruth during that storm preparation. The paramedics who had rescued Ruth flew the helicopter in again, landing in the same pasture, accepting invitations to dinner with the kind of camaraderie that emergency response created. Ruth appeared beside Claire, both of them bundled against the cold in coats and scarves, both of them overwhelmed by the turnout. "A year ago I was dying alone on a barn floor," Ruth said quietly. "Tonight I'm surrounded by people who care. How did we get here?" "You sent a horse through a blizzard asking for help," Claire said. "I answered. Everything else followed from that." "Do you regret it?" Ruth asked. "The risk you took, you could have died." Claire thought about it honestly. The terror of that journey, the hypothermia and disorientation and moments when death seemed certain, the price she had paid in frostbite and exhaustion. But then she looked at the scene before her. Ruth healthy and laughing, Emma helping set tables, David talking with neighbors, the community gathered and warm and alive. "Not for a second," Claire said. "Best choice I ever made." They went inside together, joined the celebration, told the story of that night to people who had heard it before but wanted to hear it again. The journey through the storm, the line shack refuge, the long night of keeping Ruth alive, the helicopter rescue, the partnership formed from crisis. Emma asked to hear about Rusty's journey, wanted every detail of how the mare had navigated 12 miles of blizzard. Ruth told it, her voice full of pride and love, and Rusty stood in the barn outside, probably feeling the affection that was directed toward her even from inside the warm house. As the evening wound down, as people prepared to leave, as trucks started pulling away into the winter darkness, Claire found herself standing by the fireplace with Ruth and David and Emma and the Fosters. 3 generations connected by storm and courage, and the willingness to reach across divides created by pride. David raised his glass. "To stupid, brave decisions," he said with a smile. "To sisters who ride into blizzards. To grandmothers who ask for help. To horses who are smarter than humans. To second chances and new beginnings." They drank to that, all of them, and then Emma spoke up, her voice clear and certain. "To family," she said, "the kind you're born with and the kind you choose. To my mom, who I wish I remembered better. To Grandma Ruth, who I'm glad I get to know now. To Claire, who saved my grandma's life. To all of us together." "To all of us," they echoed. Later, after everyone had left, after the house was quiet again, Claire walked out to the barn one more time. Rusty and Gunner stood together in adjoining stalls, their bond as strong as ever. Storm slept nearby, the colt that represented hope and future. Claire touched Rusty's face, felt the mare lean into her hand. "You changed everything," she told the horse. "You and your impossible courage. You ran through hell because you loved someone enough to try. You gave 2 dying women a reason to live. You're a hero, Rusty, the best of all of us." The mare nickered softly, content and warm and home. Claire walked back to the house where Ruth was banking the fire for the night, where the room still smelled of good food and friendship, where another person waited who understood this life. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, the one she had carried through the storm. 2 families before the split, 2 little girls who never got to be friends. But this generation had chosen differently, had valued connection over pride, had learned from the mistakes of fathers and built something better. The ranches that had been kept separate by stubbornness were now united by wisdom. The water rights that had destroyed a friendship now sustained a partnership. The isolation that had nearly killed them both had transformed into community. Claire Whitmore was 37 years old. Ruth Carmichael was 64. They were not mother and daughter, not exactly friends in the conventional sense. They were partners in the truest meaning of that word, partners in land and legacy and the daily work of survival, partners in grief and healing and moving forward, partners in building lives that honored the people they had lost while choosing to live fully in the present. The snow fell gently outside. Inside, the fire burned warm. 2 women who had nearly died alone now faced the future together. The horses slept in the barn, heroes who had saved their humans and would pass on their courage to future generations. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a 12-year-old girl went to bed knowing she had a grandmother who loved her and a ranch in Montana that would always be home whenever she needed it. The storms would come again. Montana guaranteed that. Winter would test them. Loss would find them eventually. Nothing was certain except the land and the sky and the connection they had chosen to build. But they would face it together. Not alone. Never alone again. The cycle that began with broken friendship and ended in isolation had been transformed into something better. Legacy was no longer about preserving what had been. It was about building what could be. And that made all the difference.